Hello, how are you? Here I will help you sleep with a crime story that has happened with the sound of comfortable rain. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for the good of all of us. Let's get started. Story 1. In 2013, I was working as part of an international task force assigned to coordinate with Interpol on high-profile fugitives. My specialty wasn't chasing suspects through back alleys or breaking down doors. It was intelligence surveillance and the silent stitching together of fragments others overlooked. But on one particular night, I found myself in the middle of the operation that ended the freedom of one of Europe's most elusive fugitives. The man's name was Alexander Volkov, a Russian-born financier who had become infamous for laundering billions through shell companies, armed smuggling rings, and offshore accounts. He was called the Ghost because he seemed to slip away each time authorities closed in. For 5 years, he had eluded capture, using forged passports, private jets, and corrupt officials to shield his movements. Our lead came in quietly, an encrypted email from a trusted source in the Balkans. Volkov had grown careless. He was planning to meet an associate in Belgrade, staying at a discreet luxury apartment under a false identity. My job was to confirm his presence. From a nondescript van across the street, I watched through thermal optics. Hours passed until finally, the door opened. A tall, silver-haired man in a tailored suit stepped out onto the balcony, lighting a cigarette. Even from a distance, I recognized him, the Ghost. We couldn't risk spooking him. Instead of storming the apartment, we waited. Our plan was surgical. Trap him between two safe houses he used, where escape would be impossible. At 2 a.m., his black Mercedes left the underground garage. That was our moment. I rode in the second vehicle, heart pounding, listening to the radio chatter as our lead car followed him through Belgrade's dim streets. The convoy closed and near a deserted intersection. When the trap was sprung, it was sudden and absolute. Unmarked SUVs blocked the front and rear. Tactical teams poured out, weapons drawn. I saw Volkov's face through the tinted glass. No panic, no resistance, just a slow exhale, as if he had always known this night would come. He stepped out, raised his hands, and muttered something in Russian I couldn't hear. We cuffed him, photographed him, and within minutes he was secured inside a reinforced van. The Ghost had finally been caught. But for me, the most chilling part came later. As I reviewed his confiscated laptop, I found a folder named after my hometown, complete with satellite images of my neighborhood and even my family's address. Volkov had known about me long before I ever laid eyes on him. That realization has never left me. Capturing him was celebrated as a major victory. But to me, it wasn't triumph. It was a reminder. In chasing criminals of his caliber, you are never the hunter alone. You are also being watched. And sometimes, the Ghost still lingers in my dreams. Next story, the case of Sabrina Queter. A horrific crime in an upscale London neighborhood. Compulsive thoughts are mental disorder characterized by the occurrence of ideas and actions that occur against a person's will and from which they cannot free themselves. In some severe cases, these thoughts can literally take over the mind, and when combined with a complex manipulative nature, innate cruelty, and a manic desire for dominance, it creates a time bomb. British Sabrina Queter had every chance of achieving the fabulous, rich, and carefree life she dreamed of from an early age, but it was never enough for her. No partner was good enough for her, and she constantly felt like she was born for fame, attention, and luxury. Her unrealized ambitions and obsessive fantasies eventually escalated into delusions with bouts of violence. Unfortunately, Sabrina found a defenseless man on whom she vented all her anger. This case became one of the most heinous and high-profile in British history. An innocent girl who cared for her children became the victim of a deranged sadist. Sabrina Queter, early years Sabrina Queter, born on December 5th, 1982 in a London suburb, had a distinctive blend of French and Algerian heritage from her parents. This unique mix likely contributed to her striking appearance and fiery temperament. The eldest of 4 children, Sabrina was a darling of her family, constantly praised and set as a model for others. At the age of 2, her family emigrated to France, settling in Paris, where she spent most of her childhood and youth. Sabrina's complex character began to manifest in her school years. Her former classmates later recalled that she was arrogant, domineering, self-absorbed, and extremely selfish. She had few friends, either at school or among her neighborhood peers, considering everyone around her unworthy of her time. To other bright, outgoing girls, she was particularly hostile, viewing them as competitors and enemies. With her stunning looks, a striking brunette with brown eyes, and an impressive figure, Sabrina could have pursued a career in modeling if she had the ability to connect with others rather than just seeking to manipulate them. As a child, she was active in sports and showed some interesting music during her youth. But her inconsistency and patience for quick results and lack of effort hindered her success in any field. Years later, Sabrina claimed she experienced harsh treatment from her maternal relatives in France during her early years. However, these claims were never substantiated or proven. Contrarily, her family insisted that she was indulged and always sought attention. As a teenager while active in sports, suffered a back injury, leading to a dependence on prescription painkillers. She tried to obtain these drugs illegally, leading to her arrest and a police warning. Sabrina was always intensely focused on herself and her appearance, craving constant attention. She had no doubt that her future held a wealthy, glamorous life filled with celebrity interactions and her own stardom. Sometimes it seemed her fantasies clouded her reality, as she believed her rightful place was in Hollywood. Sabrina graduated from the Sorbonne with a degree in English and French literature. However, since 2006, she claimed various fashion industry professions such as stylist, makeup artist, fashion designer, or designer, though she lacked real expertise in these areas. Complex relationship with Wissam Medhouni. Sabrina Cater, known for her stunning looks, had a penchant for captivating men and exploiting their affection, but she never saw any of her suitors as worthy of a serious relationship. She was literally waiting for a prince who would completely obey her. After finishing school, Sabrina was still unclear about her life goals, feeling entitled to everything without effort. Nevertheless, she enrolled at the prestigious Sorbonne University and simultaneously worked at a sweet shop for financial support. It was there at the age of 18 that she met Wissam Medhouni. Medhouni, 6 years her senior, was a manager at a major French company's head office and studied at one of Paris's most prestigious universities. He aspired to a master's degree for career advancement. Despite not being particularly handsome, part of elite clubs, or in the celebrity circle, he fell deeply in love with Sabrina and was willing to fulfill all her whims and fancies. Sabrina, too, found Medhouni appealing, seeing him as someone she could manipulate, yet also as a ticket to a wealthy life. He was ambitious and capable of great career success, and was ready to pamper and spoil her. The couple began dating in 2000, and within a few months decided to move in together. Sabrina quickly revealed her true nature, striving to control Medhouni in every aspect. If her demands were not met, she resorted to tantrums, manipulations, and even physical violence. Moreover, she soon started openly cheating on Medhouni, not bothering to hide it or justify her actions. She could engage in flings with anyone from a random acquaintance to Medhouni's best friend or colleague. Despite several attempts to end the relationship and leaving her, Medhouni always returned, unable to break free from his deep love for Sabrina. In 2001, Medhouni achieved his master's degree and a significant promotion. He began earning a substantial income, which he spent lavishly on Sabrina's luxurious clothing and entertainment. His family owned several properties in Paris, and he managed them, giving all the rental income to Sabrina. Medhouni, who also had Franco-Algerian roots, saw a kindred spirit in Sabrina. According to some reports, in the fall of 2001, the couple married in a special Muslim ceremony evidenced by a certificate issued by the Argento Y Mosque. However, this religious ceremony was insufficient to make the union official and legal. The couple had a son whose paternity Medhouni officially recognized. However, years later, a Frenchman named Anthony Francois claimed he was the child's father. Francois, a witness in Quieter's trial, described her as volatile, unpredictable, promiscuous, and manipulative. Relocation to London. In 2008, the global financial crisis hit hard, leading to the bankruptcy of the company where Wissam Medhouni worked, resulting in the loss of his high-paying job. It was around this time that Sabrina Cater developed a fixation on moving to London. She made the move without much consultation with her partner, left with little choice and hoping for a new career start in one of the world's major financial hubs. Midhuni followed her to London. Once in London, Midhuni found employment in a major English bank. However, Sabrina struggled to find her footing in the fashion industry. Her aspirations to become a designer, model, or makeup artist were hindered by a lack of skills, experience, and formal education in these fields. Consequently, she had to lower her expectations. Over time, she worked in various capacities, including as a nanny in a call center, a cafe, and even tried her hand at network marketing. Romance with Mark Walton, Sabrina Kuwaiter's quest for love took a turn when she rekindled her teenage passion for music, adding the titles of musician and composer to her resume. Despite her enthusiasm, Sabrina struggled to find professional opportunities in the music industry. She attended numerous auditions and social events, hoping to make valuable connections. At one of these events, Sabrina fortuitously met Mark Walton, a renowned musician, songwriter, and one of the founding members of the famous Irish boy band Boyzone. After leaving the group, Mark became a successful producer and music mogul, collaborated with artists like Jennifer Lopez, Jessica Simpson, and Lady Gaga. By 2016, his net worth had exceeded $1 billion. Mark was precisely the kind of person Sabrina had dreamt of meeting, her ticket to a world of fame and luxury. She managed to impress Mark with her beauty and charisma. He was captivated by her and openly admitted falling in love at first sight, unable to think of anyone but the stunning woman. Their relationship progressed rapidly, and Sabrina made efforts to remain pleasant and endearing, quickly ending her relationship with Midhuni as she saw a promising future with Mark. His previous relationship and child were no deterrent for her. Within weeks, the lovers moved in together, residing in a luxurious house in an upscale area of London. Mark took on all the expenses, including the rent for the lavish house chosen by Sabrina. For several months, Sabrina lived the opulent life she had long aspired to, socializing with celebrities, attending elite events, wearing couture clothing, and even appearing in glossy magazines. However, managing Mark proved challenging for Sabrina as she feared losing him. She couldn't control her nature for long, and soon began to show jealousy towards every woman around Mark. Sabrina's demands increased over time, seeking more gifts and luxury. Mark indulged her with designer clothes, jewelry, and outings to high-end restaurants and clubs, but it was never enough for her. The couple's home had a high turnover of staff and nannies, as Sabrina's paranoia led her believe they were either stealing or attempting to seduce Mark. Her irrational behavior eventually drove Mark to his breaking point. In 2011, he ended the relationship and left for California, leaving Sabrina with nothing. Losing Mark also meant losing the lavish lifestyle she had enjoyed. Sabrina started giving interviews, accusing Mark of cruelty, violence, and substance abuse. She called him crying, begging him to return, and even threatened to take her own life. But none of these tactics brought him back. Who was the father of the second child? After realizing she had lost Mark Walton, Sabrina Kuwaiter reached out to her ex-partner, Wissam Midhuni. Midhuni, whose career was flourishing as a bank executive, immediately forgave and accepted her back, still harboring feelings for her. They resumed living together. Shortly after reuniting with Midhuni, Sabrina discovered she was pregnant. She quickly informed Walton, who through his lawyers, expressed willingness to provide for the child and Sabrina, offering a monthly allowance. However, Walton insisted on a paternity test post-delivery to confirm his fatherhood. Sabrina's refusal to undergo the test, which could have secured her substantial regular payments, hinted at her uncertainty about the child's paternity. Instead of agreeing to the test, demanded Walton double the proposed allowance. Upon his refusal, she declared war on the musician. Sabrina took to social media, spreading false claims that Walton was obsessed with her, insanely jealous of Midhuni, and was physically threatening them. She accused Walton of breaking into their home, assaulting Midhuni, scaring the children, and sexually assaulting her in unnatural ways. However, she couldn't substantiate her claims as Walton had a solid alibi being in the United States since their breakup. After Walton filed a defamation lawsuit and the police threatened action against her, Sabrina temporarily ceased her accusations against the ex-boyfriend. She settled in Wimbledon, southwest London with Maduni and their 2 children, leading a seemingly quiet life as the conflict appeared to be resolved. French nanny Sabrina Catter, unaccustomed to managing household chores and finding it challenging to handle 2 children, decided to hire a nanny who could also assist with housework. She posted a job advertisement online and personally conducted interviews. Most candidates did not meet her expectations, and those who did not stay long in her household. A young French woman named Sophie Lyonnaise responded to the advertisement. At the time, 19-year-old Sophie was in her provincial hometown in France, so the interview was conducted via video call. This modest, unassuming provincial agreed to all terms: childcare, household help, and cooking for a symbolic weekly pay of 50 British pounds, including full board and lodging with the employer. Sophie was born on January 7, 1996, in the small town of Troyes, situated between Auxerre and Saint-Sulpice. Her parents, Catherine and Patrick Lyonnaise, were simple workers, leading a modest, if not poor, lifestyle. After finishing school, obtained a diploma in childcare, but did not wish to work in her province, aspiring instead to move to a big city. Known for being shy, quiet, and plain in appearance, but very kind and open-hearted, Sophie was loved by those who knew her. Due to poor vision, she wore glasses, which she was somewhat self-conscious about. During their conversation, Coita realized that Sophie, the plain Jane, would be an ideal target for her manipulations. Moreover, Sophie was eager to gain experience and good references, thus willing to work for minimal wages. To Sophie, Sabrina seemed like a serious and reliable employer, a fact she shared with her parents before departing for London, as kind employers turned into sophisticated sadists. Initially, things seemed to go well for Sophie Leonette, who naively believed that working for the Queters would be an excellent start to her nanny career. She quickly bonded with the children, managed household chores as per her contract, and had enough time and resources to improve her English and explore city attractions. This peaceful period lasted several months, and all seemed well. Problems began when Maduni lost his job, and the family's only stable income became the monthly child support payments from Walton, again demanded increased payment from Walton, who in turn requested a DNA test to confirm his paternity. The family faced serious financial issues, struggling with expensive rent and basic living expenses. Sabrina, unwilling to cut back on her luxuries and desperate to maintain her socialite lifestyle, became irritable and aggressive, often taking out her anger on the young nanny. The couple attempted to start a bakery business with their last funds, but it failed. Sabrina then turned to Walton, asking for a substantial amount of money to launch her clothing line, only to be met with a categorical refusal, leading to tears and complaints about poverty. Sabrina frequently complained to Lionette about her ex-lover, and the nanny tried to console her employer. What happened next varies depending on the source. According to one version, Couture conceived a plan to use Sophie as a weapon for blackmailing Walton. She intended to portray Sophie as Walton's accomplice and lover, supposedly planned in their home to disrupt their lives and endanger the children. Sabrina claimed that the provincial fool was in love with Walton, who used her as a tool for revenge. She believed that recording the nanny's confessions on tape or video and presenting them to the police would be sufficient evidence to demand compensation from Walton for his heinous act. However, Sophie refused to give false statements on camera. Another version, as argued by Queter's lawyers in court, suggested that due to her mental disorder, Sabrina genuinely believed in her conspiracy theory and saw Sophie as an enemy and a threat to her family. She allegedly didn't force a nanny to give false testimony, but truly believed Sophie was. Walton's accomplice infiltrated into their household to harm them. Regardless of the truth, Sophie's life soon turned into a living nightmare. Torture chamber in the basement of a wealthy home. Young French woman Sophie Lyonette was burdened with extra work without a corresponding increase in her meager salary. Eventually, she was engaged in endless chores from dawn to late night with no personal time and effectively imprisoned within the house walls. Sophie's pay was soon halted entirely and prevent her escape or return to France. Her employers confiscated her passport, making her a captive. Her communication with family was strictly monitored. The situation worsened. Sophie was barely fed and constantly pressured to give false statements against Walton, whom she had never met or known. She was communicated with solely through screams, insults, and threats, accused of stealing money and valuables. She was threatened with imprisonment if she failed to comply with their demands against a musician. When screaming and blackmail proved ineffective, the quitters resorted to more brutal and sophisticated methods. Sophie was effectively relocated to a cold basement, where she spent all her time when not working, fed scantily once or twice a day. She became emaciated and weak. However, the cold and hunger were not the worst she endured. Physical abuse became the most torturous stage. It started with slaps and hair pulling, but escalated when Sabrina broke Sophie's nose in a violent assault. The sight of blood seemingly unleashed Sabrina's fury, turning beatings into a daily ordeal for Sophie. Each day brought new methods of cruelty designed to inflict unbearable pain and suffering. The basement of this wealthy house in an affluent London area turned into a real torture chamber for Lionette with no hope of rescue. Strange visit to the police station. In late summer 2017, Sabrina Coiter brought the unfortunate Sophie Lionette to a police station, claiming that Sophie was ready to testify against Mark Walton, with whom she allegedly had a romantic and criminal relationship, and would supposedly send her to their house to abuse the children. However, Sophie remained silent, refusing to say what Sabrina demanded. The police decided to speak with Sophie privately and took her to a separate room. Sabrina was furious, fearing that Sophie would reveal the horrors happening at their home and implicate her and her husband. Mysteriously, Sophie chose not to disclose anything or seek help. The police's response was also peculiar. Despite seeing a malnourished, frightened, and weakened young woman, they did not call a doctor or a psychologist to ensure her well-being and safety. At that point, the 21-year-old nanny weighed less than 40 kilograms, had partially lost her hair, was missing a front tooth, and was noticeably limping. Yet none of this raised any concern with the officers, who simply let everyone go home. Disturbing phone call and a funeral pyre. In mid-September, Sophie Leanne made her final call to her mother. Sobbing, Sophie confessed to her mother that she wanted to return home, but had no money. Catherine, without delving into details, simply told her daughter that she would buy her a ticket and asked her to pack her bags immediately. This was the last time she would hear Sophie's voice. A few days later, on September 20th, 2017, in the evening, the Queeters' neighbors called the police. They were alarmed by a fire in the yard, not so much by the fire itself, but by the nauseating, sweetly greasy smell emanating from it. A neighbor said he immediately realized it smelled like burning flesh and hair, along with something unidentifiable. And the thick smoke that stretched half a block instantly impregnated clothes and skin with a stench. Firefighters and a police car arrived at the scene. The house owners, appearing calm and seemingly unaware of the reason for the emergency services visit, met them. After extinguishing the fire, what looked like a charred human hand was discovered in the ashes. The couple was immediately taken into custody, and severely burnt human remains were extracted from the fire. The gender and age of the deceased were indeterminable, but soon the body was identified as Sophie Leonette's, recognized by the melted metal frame of the glasses embedded in the skull, which Sophie always wore. Cause of death. Determining the cause of Sophie Leonette's death was challenging, as her body was almost entirely destroyed by fire. Forensic experts found multiple rib fractures, jaw cracks, and evidence of blunt force trauma on her skull and limbs, indicating she had suffered these injuries while still alive. Additionally, several of her teeth were missing, and her nose was severely damaged. It became clear that Sophie had endured prolonged and brutal beatings, resulting in broken bones and knocked-out teeth. However, assessing the state of her internal organs and identifying any penetrating wounds was impossible due to the extent of the fire damage. The discovery of horrific video recordings in the house, showing Sophie being tortured and coerced into confessing collusion with Walton and intent to harm the children, revealed the true sadistic nature of her captors. Sophie was beaten with fists, an iron cord, a golf club, and even subjected to electric shock torture. She also endured humiliations, such as being forced to submerge her head in the toilet until she began to suffocate. According to experts, Sophie likely died from asphyxiation before being burned on the pyre, sparing her from the agony of being alive during the burning. Trial and sentence. Sabrina Quitter and Wissam McHoney denied guilt and displayed no remorse for their brutal crime. After the murder, McHoney calmly went to a nearby supermarket to buy firelighter fluid for burning the body and dinner for his family, behaving as if nothing unusual had happened. The first court hearings against the sadistic couple began in March 2018. Tried to portray herself as a victim, blaming Mark Walton for driving her to a pathological state with his relentless torment. Medical examinations confirmed Sabrina had mental disorders, but was not insane and could comprehend her actions. Wissam, physically healthy, was psychologically dependent on Sabrina, dominated and blindly obedient to her. A former lover of Sabrina, testifying in court, described her as a cunning manipulator, not a madwoman, as she calculated her moves too shrewdly. Another witness stated she always fabricated enemies, but did so rationally with selfish motives. On June 26, 2018, the court found the couple guilty of torturing, humiliating, and murdering their nanny under aggravating circumstances. They were sentenced to life imprisonment, eligible for parole only after 30 years. Neither admitted guilt, continuously appealing to mitigate their sentences. Sabrina attempted to feign insanity, hoping to move from prison to a hospital, but was. Lover's actions as she committed these atrocities to gain his attention and financial compensation. He offered his deepest condolences to the victim's parents and voluntarily issued a substantial check to support the grief-stricken family who lost their beloved daughter. Story 2. In the humid summer of 1992, deep in the heart of Southeast Asia, a crime was quietly unfolding beneath the surface of the bustling metropolis of Kuala Lumpur. The city, alive with a sense of street food and the sounds of car horns and merchant shouts, wore its rapid modernization like a proud badge. But behind the neon signs and shimmering glass towers lay a murky underworld, where whispers carried more weight than laws, and secrets were currency. It was here, in the shadowy alleyways of Chowkit, that a string of brutal murders had begun to terrorize the city's undocumented population. People who had no names in any official record, whose lives flickered like candle flames easily snuffed out without notice. The victims were all men in their late 20s to early 40s, all immigrants from neighboring countries, working low-paying, high-risk jobs in construction or shipping yards. Each body was found with the same marks, a deep slash across the chest and a missing left thumb. The killings were precise, surgical, and ritualistic, suggesting that whoever was behind them had a purpose, and that purpose was not random violence. Detective Inspector Arifin Musa had been with the Royal Malaysia Police for over years, but the horrors of his case struck him on a deeply personal level. Arifin had grown up in the very neighborhoods now haunted by this faceless killer. He knew the rhythms of the streets, the coded language of fear, and the silences that spoke louder than screams. When the fifth body turned up behind a wet market, dumped in a rubbish pile like spoiled meat, Arifin's resolve crystallized into obsession. His superiors urged caution and discretion. After all, none of the victims were official residents. But Arifin knew that a killer like this would not stop until he was forced to. Working alongside a small team of loyal officers, Arifin began connecting the dots, uncovering a network of underground labor brokers, counterfeit document forgers, and an insidious black market organ trade that operated from within the city's bowels. One evening, while poring over case files in his cramped office lit only by a flickering fluorescent bulb, Arifin received a tip from an anonymous informant. The message was handwritten, delivered in an unmarked envelope, and read only. Kongsi Jalap seeks payment in blood for betrayal. It was a reference to the infamous Chinese-Malaysian triad known for operating illegal syndicates across the region. Arifin had tangled with the Kongsi Jalap once before in his early days, and the memory still left a bitter taste in his mouth. If they were involved, the case had just transformed from a serial killing investigation into something much larger, something that could destabilize an entire city. The signature wounds on the victims began to make sense in this context. The missing thumb, perhaps a symbolic punishment for betrayal. The chest wound, a mark of dishonor. Arifin's inquiries led him into the depths of Peddling Street, where whispers of a thumb taker, as the killer was now being called, were spoken of only in hushed tones. There, he met Mei Ling, a former Triad member turned informant, who revealed that the victims were part of a defection ring helping syndicate members escape to the West. The operation, known as Project Lantern, had been gaining traction among lower-rank enforcers disillusioned by the increasing brutality of the Kong Sideslup. Mei Ling, her voice trembling as she spoke, told Arifin that the killer was no ordinary hitman, but a former enforcer named Huang Wei, codenamed the Surgeon. Huang was known for his cold efficiency and loyalty to the old codes. When the higher-ups learned of the defection plot, they reactivated him. Now that Arifin had a name, a face, and a motive, the manhunt intensified. But Huang Wei was a ghost, never staying in one place for more than a night, using forged papers and the protection of his former brothers to stay ahead. Each move Arifin made seemed anticipated, as if someone within the police force was feeding information to the Triad. Trust, always a rare currency, became nearly impossible to come by. Mei Ling was found murdered 2 days after a conversation with Arifin, her body bearing the same symbolic wounds. Her death struck the team hard. It was confirmation that they were being watched, and worse, that their time was running out. Yet Arifin refused to relent. Through cross-border coordination with Interpol and triangulation of burner phone data, he finally traced Huang to a rundown apartment complex in Brickfields, not far from the city's central train station. The raid was launched at dawn, smoke grenades hissing into stairwells, tactical boots pounding through hallways. But the apartment was empty, except for a chilling message left on the bathroom mirror in blood-red ink. One thumb for one lie. You owe me 7 more. The implications were clear. 7 more intended victims, perhaps already marked. Arifin stood in the empty apartment, staring into the mirror, and for the first time in his career, felt the icy grip of fear. Not for himself, but for the city that had nurtured him, now held hostage by a killer who killed not just for vengeance, but for ideology. The hunt was no longer about catching a murderer. It was about dismantling a belief system, uprooting a silent network of blood oaths, and facing a dark chapter of the city's history that too many had tried to forget. By mid-July 1992, the case had shifted from local curiosity to a national crisis. News of the thumbtaker had leaked, despite every effort from the authorities to keep the details contained. Sensationalized headlines screamed across tabloids: blood ritual killer stalks KL, and Triad punishment or police cover-up. The public, long anesthetized by political scandals and economic turbulence, was now gripped by fear. Citizens whispered among themselves, avoiding alleyways and poorly lit streets, especially after dark. For the first time in decades, trust in the police force wavered. Meanwhile, Arifin Musa wrestled with fatigue and the creeping sense that this killer had become something larger than a man. He had become myth, a vengeful spirit echoing the sins of the past, determined to reclaim control. Arifin convened a clandestine task force within Bukit Aman, Malaysia's federal police headquarters. He recruited only those with clean internal files, including Sergeant Nasir Khalid, a tech-savvy forensic analyst with background in telecommunications surveillance, and Inspector Farah Azadi, an ambitious and meticulous profiler. Together, they launched Operation Phantom Lantern. Their first step was to revisit every crime scene, not just to search for missed clues, but to study patterns of movement, time, and message delivery. One revelation struck them hard. Each victim had once belonged to a registry of migrant workers detained in 1988 and mysteriously released under a shadow program known only as Kahaya Baisu, Silent Light. The program was meant to recruit covert assets from a migrant community to infiltrate syndicates, but none of the records existed anymore, and the few officials who had knowledge of the program had either retired or vanished. The implication was sinister. Arifin realized that the murders were not only punishment for betrayal, they were executions of loose ends. Whoever had commissioned Huang Wei may not just be the Triad, but possibly individuals within intelligence or enforcement agencies themselves. With this revelation, Arifin's paranoia deepened. His phone line crackled. Strangely, during calls, a motorbike followed his car for 3 nights. One evening, his daughter found a severed pigeon wing nailed to their gate, an old Triad warning. The walls were closing in, Then came an unexpected breakthrough. Sergeant Nasser intercepted a cryptic communication between two burner phones using an outdated shortwave band, an old smuggler's frequency. The message, partially decoded, referenced an exchange of final 7 lanterns at the Port Klang Industrial Shipping Yard. The task force prepared for an ambush. Disguised as dock workers, the officers spread out across the cargo containers and cranes under the cover of monsoon rain. At 2:43 a.m., 2 vans pulled in, headlights off, engines idling. 6 men stepped out, dragging 3 bound figures in plastic hoods. Among them was Huang Wei, his movements eerily calm, as if he were attending a ceremony rather than a murder. What followed was chaos. Gunshots cracked the silence, echoing across the steel skeletons of the port. Arifin personally tackled Huang, slamming him into a stack of shipping pallets. The killer did not resist. His eyes were distant, his voice flat when he spoke. It was never about them. It's about us. Before more could be extracted, Huang triggered a hidden blade in his boot and slit his own throat. Blood sprang across the rain-slick cement. The rest of his crew fled into the darkness. Of the 3 hooded victims, only 2 survived. The third had already been mutilated, his thumbs severed and lungs punctured. He died before dawn. Back at headquarters, the task force faced a grim truth. Huang Wei had acted with precision and discipline, but he was not the mastermind. His final words haunted Arifin. It's about us. What did that mean? Was it a condemnation of corruption within law enforcement? A betrayal among defectors? Or perhaps it was a broader philosophical war. Order versus chaos. Loyalty versus freedom. The deeper Arifin delved, the more he saw how deep the rot ran. Files were disappearing. Witnesses were recanting. And within weeks of Huang's death, pressure from senior officials forced the task force to close the case. But Arifin refused. He leaked certain findings to a trusted journalist at the Malay Herald, ensuring that at least part of the truth would live in public memory. He made copies of every file, storing them across multiple safe houses, and he visited the families of each victim, leaving a simple message with them. They mattered. We remember, in late August, he was quietly transferred to a desk job in Penang, away from investigative operations. It was a demotion, but also a message. Stay quiet and you live. Yet even in exile, Arifin remained haunted. A month after his reassignment, a parcel arrived at his office wrapped in newspaper. Inside was a single thumb preserved in formaldehyde and a note. 6 more truths to be told. The war, it seemed, was not over, only buried. The 1992 Kuala Lumpur murders faded from headlines, but they lived on in the underground, in whispered rumors, in old crime scene photographs smuggled out by reporters, and in the minds of officers who knew what had been covered up. The story of the thumb taker became one of those grim legends told among rookies, a cautionary tale of darkness that no reform or policy could wash away. Arifin, older and grayer, kept one of Huang's discarded knives in a locked drawer. He did not know why. Perhaps as a symbol, perhaps as a warning, or perhaps as a reminder that justice, in its purest form, often hides where no one dares to look. The storm had passed, but the blood had soaked deep into the foundation, and in the quiet hum of forgotten city corner, another lantern was said to flicker, waiting for its light to go out. By early 1993, Kuala Lumpur had seemingly returned to its relentless tempo. Construction resumed in the commercial districts, and political factions jostled for headlines once more. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, something had shifted in the city's soul. Fear had not disappeared. It had simply adapted, woven into the fabric of everyday life. And somewhere beyond the reach of public attention, a network that once killed in the shadows was evolving. For Detective Arifin Musa, his forced exile at Penang felt like a betrayal, not just by the institution he had served for decades, but by the ideals that had once driven him to join the force. Yet, even away from the city's center of gravity, he kept his ears open. Whispers still found him. Cryptic messages slipped under his door, anonymous calls during prayer hours, and coded symbols etched into temple walls. There was a pattern emerging, one that echoed the familiar rhythm of the past. It began again in April. A small-town mortuary, reported a corpse with an identical wound pattern, chest sliced open with almost surgical precision, and the left thumb missing. The victim this time was neither an immigrant nor a syndicate member, but a retired customs officer who once worked at the Kuala Lumpur International Airport during the late 80s. 2 weeks later, a second body surfaced in Ipoh, an ex-immigration official similarly mutilated. Araf Finn, now officially out of investigative jurisdiction, found himself standing once more at the edge of an abyss. He contacted Sergeant Nasir, now reassigned to an unrelated cybercrime unit, and Inspector Farah, who had quietly resigned and taken up work in forensic psychology overseas. Both agreed the pattern was no coincidence. Someone, or some group, was continuing the execution list left behind by Hornway. But this time, the targets were no longer defectors. They were facilitators, enablers of the old operation. It became clear that Project Lantern hadn't ended. It had evolved. Someone was tying up every last thread, ensuring that anyone connected to Kahaya Baisu would be silenced. Arafin found himself at a crossroads. He could leave it buried and preserve what little piece he had left, or he could step back into the labyrinth, without the badge, without the shield of authority, just a man chasing ghosts. Predictably, he chose the latter, with Nasir feeding him data through back doors in the police database, and Farah providing behavioral insights from abroad. Arafin began a rogue investigation. They mapped out a list of past government workers with ties to Project Lantern. The original operation had recruited over 50 names across various agencies. By mid-May, 10 were already dead. The team estimated that if the pattern continued, the remaining 40 had less than 6 months. Arafin's next move was dangerous. He contacted one of the last known survivors of the original defection ring, a man named Riddick Dar, a Bangladeshi national who had escaped Malaysia under a forged identity in 1991 and had since lived in hiding in Bangkok. Convincing Riddick to speak was nearly impossible. He believed that any mention of Project Lantern would trigger an immediate death sentence. Only after Arafin traveled to Bangkok under a false name and showed Riddick the preserved thumb in formaldehyde did the man begin to talk. He confirmed that Lantern was more than an infiltration effort. It was a contingency plan to create a pool of expendable, off-record individuals trained to carry out covert actions across borders, kidnapping, sabotage, and even assassinations. Most of them had no idea what they were being trained for until it was too late. And when they began to resist, the syndicate initiated a purge. One name came up repeatedly in Riddick's testimony. Dr. Surya Anand, a time-elation surgeon and intelligence operative with a reputation for extreme psychological conditioning. Allegedly, Dr. Anand was the original architect of the behavioral programming used in Project Lantern. According to Riddick, she vanished in 1990 following a failed extraction mission in the Philippines. But rumors suggested she was still alive, possibly pulling strings behind the recent murders. Arafin, now gripped by a sense of obligation rather than duty, pursued the lead to Chiang Mai, where a private medical facility under an assumed name showed signs of laundering funds. Through shell companies linked to defunct Malaysian intelligence fronts. With the help of a Thai journalist who owed him a favor, Arafin infiltrated the premises. There he found records, encrypted, fragmented, but unmistakable. Patient files, conditioning logs, names, photos. Among them, the unmistakable face of Huang Wei. Filed not as a patient, but as a subject. He had not been a volunteer. He had been engineered. The confrontation came in an abandoned temple outside Chiang Mai. Dr. Anand, now gray-haired and gaunt, but with eyes as cold as a scalpel's edge, did not deny her involvement. She claimed the program had been created in response to rising instability in the region, funded not just by triads, but by elements within multiple Southeast Asian governments. Her justification was clinical. In times of chaos, the cleanest solution is a weapon no one admits exists. Shaking with rage, demanded a list of the remaining targets. Dr. Anand only smiled, then handed him a data drive. You won't stop it, but you'll understand it. Moments later, a sniper shot rang through the temple walls. Arafin dove for cover, but Dr. Anand was already dead, a single round to the heart. Whoever was truly behind the purge had cleaned house again. Arafin barely escaped. Back in Penang, he decrypted the drive. It contained detailed files on every operative, handler, and facilitator tied to Lantern, past and present. He realized the killings were not just revenge. They were control. The syndicate, or whoever was left of it, was reclaiming dominance by eliminating unpredictability. Those who had built the monster were being consumed by it. And he, Arathan, was now on that list. He left Malaysia within the week. The final paragraphs of his hidden journal, smuggled to Farah before his disappearance, simply read, "Some truths cannot be prosecuted, only survived. We thought the dead were gone, but they were only seeds, scattered in darkness, and now the garden grows. No one has seen Detective Araf bin Musa since June 1993. Some say he was killed by the same hand that silenced Dr. Annan. Others claim he lives in obscurity somewhere in South America, watching, waiting. The truth, like the Lantern Project itself, remains elusive, flickering at the edge of understanding. But the legend of the Thumbtaker lives on, whispered by night watchmen, police cadets, and traffic souls crossing the borders of a region forever marked by blood and silence. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In the spring of 1993, the city of Manila, capital of the Philippines, was boiling in both temperature and tension. The general elections loomed just weeks away, and the political atmosphere reeked of corruption, betrayal, and desperation. Campaign posters were plastered on every crumbling wall, and every politician promised change, even as whispers of bribes and assassinations churned beneath their public facades. Amid this volatile backdrop, a series of kidnappings began to rock the city, quiet, clean, and precise. Not the usual targets of ransom schemes. These victims were mid-tier bureaucrats, unassuming city employees who vanished during lunch breaks or evening commutes. No ransom notes, no bodies, no public outcry, just absence. At first, the disappearances were brushed aside. Low-level functionaries in a system riddled with turnover and voluntary absences. But when the sixth victim, a city engineer named Roberto Mengubat, vanished outside City Hall in broad daylight, the story finally made it to the newspapers. The government scrambled to save face. A special unit under the National Bureau of Investigation, NDI, was formed, and at its head was Agent Cecilia C.C. Villanueva, a sharp, relentless operative known for dismantling cartel cells in Davao. CEC was no stranger to political pressure, nor to the cost of truth, but this case would test every line she had drawn for herself. CEC began by examining commonalities between the victims. All were linked to a controversial urban renewal project called Project ACEL, a multi-billion peso initiative aimed at relocating informal settlers from key metropolitan zones to newly constructed satellite towns. The victims had all served on logistics or financial auditing teams, working under different departments, but all tied to the same budget allocation path. On paper, the project seemed noble, but CEC's instinct screamed otherwise. These men were not kidnapped. They were eliminated. Digging deeper, she discovered that large sums of money had been rerouted within Project ASL development accounts. Through forensic accounting, a hidden budget trail emerged. Ghost contractors, inflated invoices, shell companies registered under false names. Someone was siphoning money, and the victims, it seemed, were close to exposing it. CEC reached out to the families of the missing. Most were frightened, hesitant to speak. But one, the wife of Roberto Mengubat, gave CEC a folded piece of paper her husband had left her the night before he disappeared. It contained a list of names and one cryptic phrase, "Blue sunlight burns coldest." CEC immediately recognized the phrase. It was an old code name from a classified operation conducted by the military in the late 80s to root out insurgent financiers. The operation had been shut down and buried due to human rights violations, but CEC had read about it in restricted files. The implication was chilling. The people behind the kidnappings weren't criminals from outside the government. They were incited, or worse, remnants of an older, covert faction still active beneath the surface. Through surveillance footage, CEC traced Mengubat's final steps to an underground parking garage. The footage showed a man in a security uniform leading him to a black van. CEC cross-referenced facial recognition databases and found a match. Sergeant Alberto Velo, an ex-military intelligence operative believed to have been killed in a skirmish 5 years earlier. His death certificate, it turned out, was a forgery. She was dealing with a phantom unit. After weeks of tailing suspects and bypassing redacted files, CEC uncovered a black site facility hidden beneath an abandoned naval base on the outskirts of Cavita. The building was a relic of the American military era, half swallowed by vines and rot. Inside, she found what could only be described as a forensic chamber, blood-slicked floors, surgical restraints, chemical burns. There were no prisoners left, only signs of experimentation and erasure. She photographed everything and sent encrypted copies to a secure drive. She knew time was running out. One night, as she returned to her apartment, Cece found her door ajar and her cat strangled with fishing wire. Her hard drives were gone, her files torched. A single phrase had been scratched into her bathroom mirror. "You can't audit shadows." Refusing to back down, Cece arranged a secret meeting with a whistleblower, a former Project ASL contractor named Dindo Resurreccion, who had gone into hiding after discovering the embezzlement. They met in a decrepit church in Tanda, where Dindo revealed that the money from Project ASL being laundered through a network known as Camelig, an old pre-war term meaning barn, a slang used by political insiders for storage places of hidden assets, whether money, people, or secrets. Camelig, Dindo said, was not just a financial operation, it was a system of political leverage, a shadow network embedded in both government and private industry, using projects like ASL to fund secret prisons, disinformation campaigns, and even extrajudicial actions. Just as he handed her a dossier with evidence, gunshots echoed through the church. Dindo fell, blood blooming from his chest. CEC returned fire and managed to escape with the dossier, but not before taking a bullet to the shoulder. She disappeared that night, going underground with help from an old contact in the media. The NBI declared the case unresolved, citing lack of evidence. Project ASL shelved indefinitely. But in the months that followed, several high-ranking officials abruptly resigned. One was found drowned in a hotel bathtub in Hong Kong. Another was killed in a car bombing outside Kaesong City. Official statements cited unrelated causes, but CEC knew someone was cleaning house. She left the country in late 1993, presumed dead by her superiors. But those who received the dossier through anonymous leaks began to piece the truth together. Kamali was real. Project ASL its shell, and the people who vanished had tried to fight it. In exile, CC began writing what she could not speak, documenting every detail under pseudonym. She titled her manuscript Cold Blue Sunlight. To this day, it has never been published, but fragments of it circulate in the underworld, among journalists, activists, and exiles. And in the heart of Manila, in the ruins of that abandoned naval base, there are still rumors that the underground rooms have new occupants, new victims, and that the shadows still have names. Agent Cecilia CEC. Villanueva's disappearance had sparked murmurs in certain government corridors, but without any official recognition of her investigation or findings, the story was allowed to die in the headlines. The public was told she had been reassigned or possibly fled the country due to stress. Only a few people knew the truth, that CEC had barely escaped an assassination attempt, wounded and now forced into the life of a fugitive. She was hidden in the northern reaches of Luzon, sheltered by an old journalist friend named Hernan Lamson, who had once exposed arms smuggling during the Marcos era. Hernan kept her alive, with antibiotics, false IDs, and a cabin wired against surveillance. But CEC refused to stay idle. Her body was healing slowly, but her mind worked relentlessly. From that makeshift hideout, she began decrypting the documents Dindo had died to deliver. The dossier held transactional ledgers, encrypted files referencing operational code names, and a staggering list of Project ASLink sites that had been used not just for laundering money, but for Black Ops detention and psychological experimentation. CEC blood ran cold as she read through accounts of illegal detainments, medically induced confessions, and death certificates forged to keep the operations invisible. One facility, dubbed Site Echo, located in a retired telecom relay bunker in Pampanga, was still marked active in logs dated only 2 months prior. The records indicated that at least 11 individuals had been held there since 1991, none of whom appeared in any court, prison, or missing persons database. Haunted by the depth of conspiracy, CEC realized that Camelot was not just a network. It was a machine, a mechanism for asset collection, control, and disposal. Its members were embedded within the justice system, military, and corporate contract. It did not function like a gang. It was a shadow bureaucracy, one that had survived regimes, coups, and elections. Driven by the need to shut it down, CEC crafted a plan. She would expose Site Echo, not through official channels which were riddled with compromise, but by turning to the very people Camelot feared most, the public. Ernan contacted former news colleagues, and a small investigative documentary team agreed to help under strict anonymity. The goal was to gather footage inside the facility, smuggle it into a broadcast feed, and leak the evidence globally in one strike. Getting inside Site Echo was nearly impossible, but CEC knew from a previous surveillance experience that utility maintenance teams often had minimal security clearance checks. Using forged documents and stolen uniforms, CEC, Hernan, and 2 operatives from the documentary team posed as telecommunications inspectors responding to outdated emergency protocols. The compound was camouflaged beneath layers of official-looking signs and unassuming infrastructure, barbed fences hidden by overgrowth, rusted satellite dishes giving the illusion of abandonment. Inside, the nightmare unfolded. The facility was far from abandoned. It had been modernized, retrofitted with soundproof containment cells and digital surveillance hubs. They found rooms filled with audio confession logs, experimental drugs cataloged in military shorthand, and most disturbing of all, a chamber with an elevated platform surrounded by one-way glass. In the center, a single chair was bolted to the floor. Restraints, blood on the floor, a feeding tray. It was not just attention. It was sensory manipulation. Before they could extract more, the alarm was tripped. CEC's team scattered. Ernan was captured during the escape and dragged back inside. CEC, holding the hard drive with footage, barely made out with the 2 others. As they sped toward Manila through back roads, CEC's face was expressionless. But inside, a storm raged. She had lost too many people. Within 48 hours, the footage was edited and scheduled for release through multiple global freelance media outlets, timed with pre-sent passwords and kill switch safeguards. CEC uploaded the first set of documents to a secure drop, timed to release if she or her companions disappeared. She could no longer rely on survival. Her weapon now was truth. On June 9th, 1993, the footage aired simultaneously in Berlin, Manila, and Tokyo. Grainy, shaky visuals revealed Site Echo's chambers, logs, and audio files of interrogations. Sesay's distorted voice narrated, while identity-protected footage of her team backed every claim. The reaction was seismic. International watchdogs demanded accountability. Human rights groups flooded the region. The Philippine government was forced to launch a full inquiry, but not before someone struck back. On the night of June 11th, 2 of CEC's accomplices were killed in a motel fire outside Baguio. Arson? No arrests were made. Hernan was never seen again. But CEC remained in hiding, releasing 1 file per week for the next month, each more damning than the last. Among the final leaks was a full personnel list of Camelot operatives, many of whom began disappearing or dying under mysterious circumstances across Southeast Asia. It was a purge from within. CEC's final communication was a voice recording uploaded to a secure radio transmission. You cannot dismantle the system from the top, only from inside. Kamali was born in silence, sustained in darkness. Let it now rot in light. No one knows where she is today. Some say she escaped to Taiwan under a new identity. Others claim she was killed by foreign agents. But the legend of Agent CC Villanueva persists. Her story is passed between journalists, taught in underground seminars on whistleblowing, even whispered in the ranks of junior law enforcers who still hope for something cleaner than politics. And somewhere hidden among corrupted servers and forgotten folders, the remnants of Project ASL Camelot remain broken, exposed, but never quite dead, because shadows don't vanish. They retreat and wait. The weeks following the explosive release of the Camelot documents were marked by chaos across Southeast Asia's political landscape. Governments scrambled to distance themselves from the black operations, revealed in the leaks. Civil society exploded with protests. NGOs called for mass inquiries, and members of the international press descended on Manila, Tokyo, Bangkok, and Kuala Lumpur, chasing the unraveling threads of conspiracy that spanned decades. But even as sunlight hit the dark corners, the roots of Kamalik proved too deep. Files disappeared. Mid-level operatives were either silenced or relocated, and the names at the very top, the one CEC had sought most, remained untouchable. Agent Cecilia Villanueva had vanished again. Some speculated she was hiding in Taiwan. Others claimed she had been airlifted by Australian intelligence in exchange for immunity. A few whispered that she had never left Luzon and now lived among farmers in the north, carrying a pistol and a box of untraceable hard drives. The truth was simpler, but more tragic. CEC had gone aground with a final purpose: to end the story completely and permanently. A month after the last document leaked, a new message appeared on a hidden board used by freelance investigative journalists. It contained a single sentence: "There is one last room." Alongside it, a GPS coordinate, somewhere in the hills of Butangas. The message came with a digital signature unmistakably CEC's, matching encryption used in our earlier files. A handful of trusted journalists and activists formed a quiet coalition. No fanfare, no press, just a shared belief that whatever was in that room would be the conclusion of everything she'd uncovered. They found it buried beneath a burned-out coffee plantation. A steel hatch, rusted and chained. Below it, a staircase led into what had once been a communications bunker, likely built during the Marcos era. Inside, the air was thick with mold and disuse, but the walls were intact, lined with file cabinets and old servers, humming weakly off an underground power source. CEC had converted it into an archive, a terminal for truths. Inside were the raw files, the unedited footage from Site Echo, testimonies of Kamlik survivors, their faces blurred but voices clear, unpublished drafts of her memoir, fragments of her own journal entries, and an encrypted list of names, one that matched previously unreleased code names from the first dossier. Among them were sitting senators, business moguls, military chiefs, the foundation of Kamlik, a secret society masquerading as civil servants. CEC's final journal entry was found inside a small locker, written on legal pad pages wrapped in plastic. It read, "You cannot reform rot. You can only raise it and start over. Kamalik is not an organization. It is a philosophy, obedience without conscience, loyalty without scrutiny. You feed it by forgetting. So remember everything. Remember what silence protects, what money buries, what ambition distorts. I won't see what comes next, but I've done what I can. The rest is yours." The message was signed simply CV. 2 days later, an unmarked body was found floating off the coast of Quezon. Female, mid-30s, single gunshot to the heart. No ID, no dental records. The body was buried as a Jane Doe, but among those who read the files, there was no doubt who it was. Her death sparked a silent wave of retaliation. Several known Kamalik associates were exposed in a leak weeks later. Arrests were made in Cambodia and Vietnam. A major energy contract between Malaysia and China was suddenly frozen after key contractors were linked to ghost facilities mentioned in CEC's archive. In the Philippines, a grassroots reform movement known as Alawang Siglo, the Century's Light, emerged from the ashes. It was started not by politicians, but by former journalists, exiled students, and the families of the disappeared. Her story became legend. In 1994, the International Human Rights Tribunal acknowledged the existence of Kamlik as a transnational organized network with links to government corruption, although it stopped short of naming all its operatives. A memorial stone was quietly placed on the steps of the old NBI building in Manila, etched with the words, "For the disappeared, for those who made silence speak." To this day, portions of CEC's archives remain unreleased, not out of fear but strategic caution. Activists say they are part of a last light protocol, only to be published if Kamlik resurfaces in force. But there are signs that the machine is stirring again. In early 1995, another low-level administrator vanished in Quezon. His last known assignment? Budget tracking for a rural development project eerily similar to Project ASL somewhere deep in digital backchannels. A new file is rumored to exist. It bears a single name as its title, Anakin Assel, Child of Blue, and with it, the cycle may begin again. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In the final months of 1993, as winter cast a pale shroud over East Asia, the once vibrant city of Busan in South Korea began to spiral into an atmosphere of hushed paranoia. Far removed from Seoul's political theater, Busan had always been a city of contradictions. Its rusting shipyards and ancient temples resting beside neon-lit arcades and bustling seafood markets. But beneath the surface of daily life, something malignant had taken root. A string of unconnected deaths, at least on the surface, began drawing quiet attention from a handful of city investigators. The victims were all found in different parts of the city. A port customs officer slumped inside a ferry engine room. A retired judge discovered lifeless at a hilltop shrine. And a university professor found burned inside a locked car just outside Houndy Beach. No official links were drawn. Each death was ruled accidental or due to natural causes. But one man believed otherwise. Detective Won Do-jin, a veteran of the Busan Metropolitan Police with a career forged during the country's authoritarian era, had learned over decades that true crime often wore a mask of coincidence. Having spent the last few years relegated to desk work, due to his refusal to bow to a rising tide of politically connected officers, Juan now walked with a limp, a stiff shoulder, and a head full of unfinished questions. When news of the third body reached him, Professor Young Kibum, a scholar known for his research into Korea's post-war intelligence networks, Juan's instinct screamed that the professor's demise wasn't just arson, it was a message. What drew Juan into the shadows wasn't just the bizarre pattern of deaths, but the strange phrase scrawled on the inside of Professor Young's scorched car window written in soot. Operation Snowbell. The phrase meant nothing to his younger colleagues, but to Juan, it was like a slap from the past. Snowbell had been a rumored covert operation during the 1970s, an unofficial alliance between remnants of Korea's military intelligence and organized crime networks designed to suppress dissent and control port commerce in Busan, though never publicly confirmed. Whispers of the operation had haunted law enforcement circles for decades, had once chased its echoes in the back alleys of Jigok Market, only to have his investigation shut down by a superior who promptly received a promotion and vanished into a government post abroad. Haunted by the past and driven by something bordering on obsession, Juan began revisiting old case files from the 70s and 80s, comparing names, places, and disappearances. What he found was a tapestry of suppressed files, sealed testimonies, and redacted reports. And more chilling still, he discovered that all three recent victims had once served as civilian consultants to a maritime security agency that was quietly dissolved in 1982. The connection was undeniable. These weren't random deaths. Someone was eliminating ghosts. The further one pushed, the more resistance he encountered. Requests for file access were denied. His internal messages were flagged. One night, returned home to find his apartment ransacked. Nothing was taken, but the message was clear. Stop digging. But Juan was too far gone. He reached out to the only person he knew would understand, Choi Masuk, an investigative journalist who had once exposed corruption in the defense ministry before being blacklisted. Masuk, living in a one-room apartment above a print shop, still kept an archive of the documents the press wouldn't touch. With her help, Juan pieced together fragments of Operation Snowbell. The operation had used shell companies to launder money through fishing cooperatives, using academic and legal advisors as fronts to sign off on fake port security contracts. The moment those men started talking, years later, now in retirement, they became liabilities. Juan and Masuk tracked their next lead, a former maritime intelligence officer named Kong Jae-wook, now living as a recluse in GOJ. When they found him, he was already on the brink of collapse, paranoid, half-mad, drowning in guilt. He admitted that Operation Snowbell had never truly ended. It had simply adapted. With the arrival of democracy, the old structures had folded into legitimate businesses, political consulting firms, and international trade groups. But the loyalty remained, enforced by fear and blood. Kong spoke of a man known only as Baekdu, a code name for the enforcer of the Old Circle, now reborn as the head of a private intelligence consultancy operating in both Seoul and Tokyo. Kong believed Baekdu was behind the murders, orchestrating them to ensure nothing from the past could resurface before South Korea's upcoming 1994 trade summit. But before Hwan could act, Kong was found dead in his cottage 2 nights later, a slit wrist and a confession note neatly placed beside an old military badge. The handwriting didn't match Kang's, and Hwan knew it. With the walls closing in and no official support, Hwan and Mi-suk made a desperate decision. They would go public, not with a press release or a newspaper story. That would be buried. Instead, they would create a fake leak, crafted to look like a whistleblower from within the Trade Summit security team. It would contain just enough verifiable detail to draw attention from foreign press and spark international scrutiny. They gathered evidence, forged plausible access points, and used Mi-suk's blacklisted media contacts in Japan and the UK. The leak was launched on December 10th. Within 24 hours, a foreign correspondent in Tokyo asked the Korean government to comment on the Snowbell inquiry. The Korean press couldn't ignore it. Suddenly, Hwan's story was everywhere. Conspiracy headlines, debate panels, denials from the Blue House. But the public was curious. The old names resurfaced. People remembered. Then as quickly as it came, the story was killed. The press issued quiet corrections. Commentators recanted. Social media threads disappeared. Mi-suk's website was hacked and wiped. And Hwan received an official letter from Internal Affairs. He was being investigated for misconduct. But something had already shifted. In Busan's back streets and late-night cafes, old veterans and young students whispered the same phrase. Snowbell rang again. One had expected retaliation. What he didn't expect was the anonymous envelope that arrived at his office 2 weeks later. Inside was a photo of Baekdu, unmasked, standing in a crowd at a diplomatic event in Singapore. His name handwritten on the back in Hangul, Cho Sun-ho, a man with no official past, yet deeply embedded in South Korea's global image. And beneath the photo, one sentence. The winter isn't over. The envelope was a warning, or perhaps an invitation. Hwan Do-jin couldn't be sure. The image of Cho Sun-ho Baekdu was unmistakable. Time had aged him, but the eyes were the same ones Hwan had seen in grainy black and white surveillance photos from the 1970s. That calm, flat stare. It was the face of a man who had survived countless purges, outlasted 3 regimes, and buried more secrets than most would dare imagine. Hwan felt the pull of dread, but also purpose. He wasn't alone anymore. Someone out there wanted Baekdu found, and perhaps even destroyed. Mi-suk, now constantly moving between safe houses, arranged a meeting with a contact in Tokyo who claimed to have dealt with Cho Sun-ho during his years as a consultant for Nippon Techno Group, a powerful security firm tied to multiple post-Cold War reconstruction contracts. The meeting took place in a ramen shop basement near Shinjuku. The contact, an elderly Japanese bureaucrat named Hiroto-san, slid a sealed manila folder across the table. Inside were travel manifests, digital memos, and most chillingly, a surveillance photo of Baekdu meeting with a Korean diplomat just a month prior. The timing aligned precisely with the first murder in Busan. He does not kill for pleasure, Hiroto whispered, but he does not hesitate. He believes history is shaped by shadows, not light. With the new evidence in hand, Hwan and Mi-suk returned to South Korea under false names. They moved cautiously, contacting only those few allies who had resisted corruption during their years of service. A retired intelligence analyst, now working as a priest in Taegu, a former data technician, now driving a taxi. Slowly, the shape of the operation returned to focus. Baekdu had never really left. He simply evolved, embedding himself into the network of post-dictatorship politics, economic reform, and international diplomacy. He used the very tools of democracy, consulting firms, policy advisors, public-private partnerships, to hide his influence. And every so often, when the past began to echo, he sent silence. One decided they had only one chance left. They needed to confront Baekdu directly, not to arrest him. No official channels would support that, but to trap him, to push him into the open, if only long enough to reveal his hand. Masuk devised a plan to bait Baekdu into a meeting. She would pose as an intermediary for a supposed Western media conglomerate offering to bury the Snow Bell story in exchange for exclusive consulting access to South Korean trade policy. A ridiculous lie, but one credible enough to spark Baekdu's interest. Ego, after all, was always a predator's weakness. The meeting was set for a private lounge in Seoul's Yedo district, under the guise of an informal diplomatic dinner. One would attend as Masuk's silent partner, armed with hidden cameras, encrypted recorders, and a fail-safe broadcast trigger. They prepared for the encounter with the meticulous desperation of two people who knew they might not survive. Baekdu arrived precisely on time. No bodyguards, no entourage. He wore a tailored gray suit, a polite smile, and the air of a man who had dined with presidents. His voice was calm. His eyes studied them without flinching. He never once acknowledged his real name, but in the way he spoke in coded phrases, historical references, and subtle threats, it was clear that he knew exactly who they were. You cannot exhume a nation's memory without unearthing the blood that feeds its roots, he said, pouring wine without pause. Korea became what it is today because we made it ruthless enough to survive. What you call corruption, I call sacrifice. Hwan clenched his fist beneath the table. Miss Suck didn't blink. She let Bates speak. He talked of markets, borders, enemies both foreign and domestic. He framed his deeds as necessity. Then with a half-smile, he said, "You think history remembers men like me? It doesn't. It remembers peace, prosperity. Those are the lies I gave this country. You're welcome." When the meeting ended, Bates stood, nodded, and said, "This was your one chance to understand. I suggest you use it wisely." 3 hours later, the video was in the hands of a Korean legislator long rumored to be an enemy of the old guard. Within a day, the recording was leaked to an underground media channel in Germany. By the end of the week, translations were circulating across activist forums worldwide, though Baekdu's identity was never officially confirmed. The code phrases he used matched declassified CIA and KCIA transcripts from the 1970s. The government did not respond publicly, but behind closed doors, a quiet purge began. Several known associates of Baekdu were arrested under charges ranging from tax evasion to foreign lobbying violations. Cho Sun-ho himself vanished. Rumors claimed he was exiled to Singapore or perhaps quietly executed by his own allies for becoming a liability. Hwan and Mi-suk went their separate ways. He retired permanently, living under a new name in a village near Gangnam. She continued writing under a pseudonym, her voice becoming a beacon for South Korea's emerging reformist movement. In the spring of 1994, a small plaque appeared near the docks of Busan. It bore no name, only a phrase, "Let no snow fall without memory." Operation Snowbell was never officially acknowledged, but for those who paid attention, its echo shaped every conversation about South Korea's rise from dictatorship to democracy. And in the hidden spaces between progress and power, the ghosts of its victims continued to whisper, waiting for someone else brave or foolish enough to listen. The winter, as it turned out, had simply changed form. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. The bitter winter of 1993 had clamped down hard over Eastern Europe, casting a dull, metallic haze over the crumbling facades of Bucharest. Romania, still reeling from the violent collapse of Ceausescu's regime just a few years prior, was in the midst of an uneasy rebirth. Its people torn between hope and desperation. Its government laced with hidden remnants of the old order. Amid the gray avenues and shuttered factories, a different kind of storm had begun to swirl in secret. A series of bodies, cleanly killed, no witnesses, no noise, were found abandoned in different districts of the city. Most shared nothing in common. A minor banker, a retired army colonel, a museum archivist. Their lives, at least on paper, were utterly unconnected. But for Lieutenant Soren Dragomir, now working within the newly restructured Criminal Investigations Bureau, something felt off. Each of the bodies bore a small signature carved into the flesh, barely visible under the collarbone, a stylized L marked with 2 vertical slashes. Soren had seen something like it before, during the final chaotic days of 1989, when secret police documents were burned en masse and executions took place behind courthouse walls. A similar sigil had been found on the corpse of a defector journalist pulled from the Dambovita River. The case was never officially recorded, but Soren had kept the photograph hidden in the lining of his old coat. Now, for years later, the same ghost had returned. He didn't report it first. Too many of his colleagues were either former Securitate officers in disguise or young men eager to forget the past. He needed someone he could trust, someone beyond reach. He reached out to Ilinka Popescu, a former intelligence analyst turned translator for a German news outlet. She had a knack for pattern recognition and a long memory. When she saw the photos, she didn't blink. "It's Lumnia," she said. The name carried the weight of supposedly. Lumnia was a code name of a clandestine liquidation unit that had operated outside of Securitate's official records. They specialized in erasing threats not only to the communist regime, but to the regime's economic future, particularly those who knew about black market currency routes and secret Swiss accounts. According to whispers among ex-intelligence circles, Lumnia had never been fully dismantled. Its operatives had simply vanished or gone freelance. Digging deeper meant crossing invisible lines. Soren and Alinka began combing through Cold War financial archives, intercepted wire transfers, and confiscated briefings from 1990s post-revolution purges. One name kept appearing, sometimes misspelled, often redacted: Victor Sava, formerly a mid-level bureaucrat in the Ministry of Trade. Sava had disappeared in late 1988 during a foreign business trip to Vienna. Rumors claimed he'd been one of the key architects of Romania's offshore laundering systems. Others believed he had defected and was killed before he could speak. But Alinka found something odd. A German property registration dated mid-1991, listing of Victor Sava as an executive for a shell company in Hamburg. The firm had ties to several logistics chains across Romania and Bulgaria, companies that now handled shipments from multinational corporations entering the fragile Eastern market. Soren knew what that meant. Someone had buried the past under the currency of globalization. Lumnia wasn't just a vestigial organ of communism. It had adapted. It was now a silent mechanism inside post-revolution capitalism. Those being killed were liabilities, either because they knew too much or because they once benefited from the old schemes and were now trying to speak out. The L wasn't nostalgia. It was a contract. As they followed the thread, the danger escalated. Ilinka's apartment was broken into while she was at work. Nothing stolen, just drawers rearranged, files sifted. A warning. Soren's informant inside the Ministry of Interior Affairs, an idealistic graduate named Radu, stopped responding to calls. 2 days later, Radu was found dead, struck by an unregistered vehicle on a quiet street. No witnesses. The report was filed and forgotten within hours. They decided to confront one of the few men still alive from the original Securitate financial branch, Dr. Teofil Monteanu, now a professor of economics at a private university. He lived in seclusion, guarded by a former paratrooper and rarely speaking to journalists. Alinka posed as a doctoral candidate seeking interviews for a dissertation. Monteanu granted her a 15-minute audience. Soren waited outside, recording the conversation via a transmitter hidden in her bag. Monteanu didn't reveal much, but his expressions were more valuable than his words. When Ilinka mentioned the recent murders, he tightened. When she mentioned the sigil, he paled. And when she uttered Lumnia, he simply ended the interview, rising with stiff urgency and whispering, "You shouldn't say that name." Later that night, Soren and Ilinka returned to Monteanu's residence, only to find it swarming with unmarked vehicles. Officially, he had suffered a stroke, but the man they wheeled out on a stretcher looked nothing like someone struck by natural illness. He was pale, motionless, and his paratrooper guard was nowhere to be seen. By December, the killings had stopped, but not because Lumnia was finished. No, it had simply completed its purge. Those who had dared speak were gone. Those who remained had either been silenced or frightened back into loyalty. Soren submitted his findings anonymously to a Swedish human rights NGO through an encrypted channel, attaching copies of documents, photos, and recordings. He and Alinka then vanished, new identities, smuggled westward with the help of sympathetic ex-diplomats. Romania was changing, yes, but in the shadows beneath its rebirth, the roots of the past were still very much alive. 1 month later, an anonymous report titled "The Lumnia Doctrine: Murder in the Shadow of Transition" appeared in select academic circles across Europe. It named no names, but for those who knew where to look, it was a map, and somewhere beneath the cracked stone streets of Bucharest, someone received a single page in the mail, a photograph of Soren and Ilinka standing outside Montiano's University, time-stamped. On the back, 3 words were handwritten in blood-red ink. "You are remembered." The snow didn't fall that January in Bucharest, as if even nature had gone quiet to listen. Soren Dragomir had always believed that justice was not a straight road, but a fractured mirror. Sometimes it reflected truth, but often it reflected only the face of the one brave enough to look. Hidden now on the outskirts of Prague under forged documents and an assumed name, Soren watched from a distance as the world moved on. Romania appeared in headlines only when convenient. New trade deals, IMF loans, tentative steps toward European integration. No mention of the buried corpses, no whisper of Lumnia, not a single name named. But beneath that silence, Ilinka continued the war. She had re-emerged in Berlin, using a pen name to publish serialized exposés, through a dissident publisher with contacts in both Brussels and Sofia. Her style was sharp, poetic, devastating. Her readers didn't know who she was, but those who had something to fear recognized the shape of her words. Every few months, a name would vanish from Eastern business registries. A company would fold without explanation. A former minister would resign citing health reasons. She was striking not with bullets, but with documentation, and that made her far more dangerous. One day in late February, Soren received a package with no return address. Inside was a single VHS tape labeled Black Channel. When he played it, the screen flickered to reveal a grainy recording from 1988, an unmarked interrogation room, a steel table, and a younger Victor Sava strapped to a chair. The footage showed him confessing under pressure, describing in chilling detail the offshore systems, Swiss intermediaries, and the use of liquidation squads to silence defectors. The tape ended abruptly with the sound of a door opening and a man entering the room. The camera tilted slightly, catching a partial profile. Soren paused the frame. It was unmistakable Montianu. They had both been part of it, the architect and the enforcer, and now both were either dead or missing. Soren sent the tape to Ilinka via courier, along with a single note. "Use it carefully. They're watching both of us." The backlash came swift and silent. Within a week, a fire engulfed the small Berlin print office, distributing her work. Official reports blamed an electrical short. Ilinka escaped unharmed, barely, but 2 junior editors were hospitalized with burns. The message was clear. This was no longer a memory war. It was a live one. Soren tried to convince her to stop. He sent coded messages, offered to meet her in Vienna, to disappear for good, but she refused. "This is the only justice we'll ever see," she replied, not in courtrooms, but in the collapse of their empires. Meanwhile, Romania's internal structure began to twitch. A minor parliamentary committee on historical crimes was quietly dissolved. A bill proposing transparency in state archives was blocked by a coalition of centrist parties, and one by one, the surviving names linked to Lumnia began to vanish again from public life, from records, from sight. Soren realized then that this was not just a cover-up, it was institutional reincarnation. The same machinery that once operated under the hammer, and Sickle now wore suits and spoke in investment language. But the essence remained: preserve control, eliminate threat, rewrite history. In March, an encrypted message reached Soren through a darknet relay. It was from a contact within the Swiss Central Prosecutor's office. The contents were chilling. Someone had attempted to access Ilinka's banking data, using credentials tied to a now-defunct Geneva account, once belonging to a logistics firm named Ostverdex AG. The same firm Ilinka had tied to Sava's Hamburg shell companies. She was being hunted, and it wouldn't be with guns next time. It would be with forged charges, extradition warrants, manufactured scandals. Soren had no choice. He reached out to one final contact, a disillusioned former Interpol agent named Liesel Klemper, who had once worked Balkan trafficking routes before resigning in protest over the political interference in her investigations. She agreed to help exfiltrate Ilinka through Slovenia, with backup plans to reroute her through Graz if things turned hot. But Ilinka never arrived. She disappeared somewhere near the Hungarian border. Her last message to Soren was a single word: red leaf. For weeks, he scoured every channel. Disinformation flooded the underground networks. Fake sightings in Istanbul, Paris, even Montreal, but none credible. Redleaf would later discover was the name of a Cold War-era farmhouse in Serbia used by rogue operatives for extraction or elimination, depending on who you were. Then, in late April, a package arrived at Soren's safe house. No markings. Inside was a sealed letter and a microcassette. The handwriting was hers. "I'm alive," it began. They got close. Closer than I expected. But I've gone deeper. No more headlines. No more names. Only systems. If this reaches you, know that I found a way in. Redleaf was never just a place. It's a protocol. She explained how Lumia had evolved, not into a single organization, but into a self-sustaining algorithm of influence. Corporations with bloodlines tracing back to the old regime. Boardrooms with seats reserved for ghosts. Redleaf, she said, was a final safeguard, a last resort to erase compromised agents. But she had found its kill switch. The microcassette contained one name, a sitting member of the European Parliament, known for their anti-corruption platform, secretly linked to offshore accounts dating back to 1986. It was just the beginning. Soren never heard from her again, but months later, a public scandal erupted in Brussels. The politician in question resigned amidst a financial probe. No one connected it to Lumnia. No one except Soren. He walked the streets of Prague with a new calm. The war was still on, but the battle had moved into deeper waters. And sometimes, the only way to kill a machine built on silence was with persistence. Or, as Ilinka once wrote in her final sign piece before disappearing, revolution does not end with the fall of a regime. It begins with a memory of what that regime made us forget. The city snow finally came in May late, soft and quiet, just the way ghosts prefer it. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. In the dim haze of a rain-slicked morning in Marseille, France, 1993 unfolded with the whisper of betrayal already curled in the shadows of the city's docks. The port city, nestled between the blue, gray waters of the Mediterranean and the disheveled sprawl of centuries-old buildings, had always played host to smuggling tales, whispered contracts, and untouchable men in tailored suits. But what was planned for that January would be unlike anything Marseille had seen in decades. A meticulously orchestrated robbery that would rip through the heart of the French banking system, an echo across European financial circles for years to come. The brains behind the heist was a man named Lucien Varga, a former safe engineer turned underground tactician. Lucien had once been contracted to upgrade the vault systems of Banque General Europeenne, a private vault institution nestled on RU parity. His genius was mechanical, his demeanor cold. After fallout over unpaid consultancy fees and a quiet blacklisting by major banks, Lucien vanished from corporate registry. What no one realized was that he hadn't disappeared. He'd been watching. For 3 years, Lucien planned. Not just a robbery, but a symphony of infiltration, deception, an exit strategy that would require military precision, and a cast of professionals who could vanish without a trace. By autumn 1992, the crew was assembled. First was Clara Nowak, an explosives expert from Prague, expelled from her country's army after a scandal involving the black market sale of Semtex. Then came Antonio Rivas, a Spanish getaway specialist with a record of evasive driving that defied belief. He'd once escaped a high-speed pursuit to Madrid using only a Vespa and 3 dead-end alleys. The hacker was young, barely 22, known only as Owl, a reclusive Polish tech savant who could breach any mainframe using a laptop and a satellite uplink. The final recruit was the most dangerous, Emile Durand, a disgraced gendarme turned hitman whose knowledge of police procedure and brutal efficiency made him a quiet threat in every room. They met in silence, never twice in the same place. Warehouse rooftops, abandoned rail cars, and half-built construction sites served as their planning grounds. Lucian provided blueprints, schedules, guard rotations, everything he had memorized during his time working for the vault. Al provided digital access codes stolen from internal servers. Clara developed shaped charges that could open steel without a sound. Emil tracked the personal lives of security heads, mapping emotional leverage and behavioral gaps. The vault in question wasn't just any vault. Banque Generale Européenne was a private security firm that held not just physical cash, but bearer bonds, rare metals, artworks, and documents worth far more than currency. Its clients were politicians, oligarchs, CEOs, people who operated above courts and borders. And that was the point. Lucian wasn't just planning a robbery. He was staging a reckoning. The date was set January 27, 1993, the night of the regional power grid shift, when Marseille's older substations would transition power lines, dimming 3 city blocks for exactly 120 seconds. It was a minor maintenance schedule, known only to engineers and deemed irrelevant to the public. But Lucian knew. At 2:14 a.m., a rented bakery van turned the corner onto Rue Parody. The back was hollowed out and lined with soundproof panels. Clara and Emil emerged first, both dressed as janitorial contractors with fabricated ID badges matching those of the bank's night crew, remained in a nearby apartment rooftop, fingers dancing over keys, intercepting alarm logs, and sending back loop signals to the Central Security Board. For 10 minutes, the surveillance system registered calm while every camera inside the vault corridor looped a still frame of empty silence. Amiel neutralized the 2 night guards with tranquilizer darts. Efficient, quiet, non-lethal, Clara placed her charges with surgical precision, ensuring the vault would open with 0 structural damage. At 2:16 a.m., the lights flickered. The grid shift had begun. In the 2-minute blackout, the final barrier, an electromagnetic lock tied to a biometric protocol, was disabled. Al spoofed the final handshake, and the vault door hissed open. Inside were 314 deposit boxes. They opened only 26. But those 26 had been chosen for specific reasons. Each belonged to a high-value client with connections to international arms dealings, government espionage, or cartel finance. The contents were not publicly traceable, which meant the theft would never be reported in full. That was Lucian's brilliance. Rob the powerful, who could not admit they had been robbed. By 2:24 a.m., they were gone. No alarms had sounded. No lights had returned. The van disappeared into the maze of portside roads, then into a cargo container preloaded on a ship bound for Cyprus. By morning, Marseille police had nothing but a list of seemingly undisturbed assets and a security system that showed nothing amiss. It was only when the first private client tried to access Box 112 3 days later that the theft was discovered. The scandal was internalized, hushed. The bank denied everything. Insurance records were altered. By the time investigators began to piece together inconsistencies, Lucian's crew had vanished into the folds of Europe. But what Lucian hadn't anticipated was that Emil had a contingency, a copy of every document they had taken, including one that implicated a sitting French minister in an arms for oil scandal. Emil saw leverage where Lucian saw purity. He made contact with an Italian journalist known for his fearlessness, Marco Spalletti, and offered to trade protection for exposure. When the minister's resignation hit headlines in late February, the fuse was lit. Lucian, furious at the breach of protocol, went dark. He blamed Emil's selfish move for putting them all at risk. Tonio fled to Morocco. Clara returned to Prague and went underground. Al disappeared from the net entirely. The crew had succeeded, but the prize had become a poisoned chalice. The documents they stole were too powerful, too political, too dangerous to handle. And somewhere in the corridors of French intelligence, a list was being drawn, one that had 5 names, each marked with a black star. And in a quiet cafe in Lisbon, Emile Durand waited for his contact, unaware that the man sent to meet him was not Marco Spalletti, but someone far colder. The man who entered the Lisbon cafe was not Marco Spalletti. He wore the journalist badge, carried a satchel, and even used his mannerisms. But his eyes were wrong. Emile Durand, who had survived Balkan ambushes and internal betrayal in the gendarmerie, recognized it at once. The absence of curiosity. True reporters had a hunger, a glint. This man had only calculation. By the time Emil reached beneath the table to retrieve the small signal jammer he'd placed minutes earlier, it was already too late. A needle pricked his neck. A microdose of something efficient, maybe succinylcholine. And in seconds, he was unconscious. By the time the cafe's barista returned to refill cups, the two men were gone. 2 days later, a body was found floating along the Tagus River. The face bloated, fingerprints burned. No one claimed him. Local police labeled it a vagrant accident, but the photos circulated in certain encrypted forums, where few former agents looked twice and never spoke again. One of the 5 names had been crossed out. Far away in Cyprus, Lucy and Varga burned every connection. He changed passports, walked through alleys in disguise, and used codes no longer in use. He trusted no one, not even Tonio, who had kept radio silent since fleeing Morocco. But Lucian's paranoia had limits. In Istanbul, he reached out to a fixer named Layla, a woman who once helped him obtain forged Greek maritime credentials. She was reliable, or so he believed. What Lucian didn't know was that Layla had been compromised 6 months earlier. Her brother had been arrested in Izmir for illegal arms trading, and Turkish intelligence had used the opportunity to turn her. She had orders monitor, don't interfere unless Lucian resurfaced. The moment he walked into her Beagle apartment, she knew the end had begun. She fed him misinformation, told him the documents had been sold to a Czech arms lobby, that Clara had flipped to authorities, and that Al was suspected to be working for Mossad. Lucian didn't flinch. He simply nodded, took his tea, and waited. That night, he left before dawn. Layla never saw him again. But weeks later, her apartment exploded in a gas leak. Officially, she died in her sleep. Unofficially, she had been tied to a chair. Meanwhile, Al resurfaced in the most unexpected of ways. In late March, a Romanian tech collective published a paper on the vulnerabilities of European interbank transfer protocols. The paper wasn't signed, but its code signature was traced by French cyber intelligence to the owl's known encryption fingerprints. The document outlined in unnerving clarity how any mid-sized hacker collective could siphon funds invisibly through microtransaction echoes. It was a threat or a promise. French authorities took it seriously. The banking community went into quiet panic. The original heist had been humiliating but manageable. This was different. If Al had turned ideological, they weren't facing a thief. They were facing a prophet. Back in Prague, Clara lived like a ghost. She moved through forgotten districts and paid everything in coin. Her former contacts no longer responded. One morning, she found a red envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single photo, Lucy and Vargo walking near Istanbul's Galata Tower. On the back, "You are next." That night, she retrieved a buried package from beneath a defunct rail station. Inside was a pistol, 2 vials of cyanide, and a forged ID in the name of Irina Vakulikova. She vanished the next morning. Whether she fled or took her own life, no one knows. All that remained was a burned apartment, and a neighbor's memory of a quiet woman who fed stray cats. By May, Tonio was the only one left without a traceable footprint. But that changed when a journalist named Elena Carvalho received a USB drive delivered by taxi. On it were 6 documents implicating 3 Spanish banking executives in laundering drug money through offshore art auctions. Information Tonio had found among the vault's contents. Elena published the expose. 2 days later, Tonio was seen in Seville, entering a cathedral in disguise. He never emerged. The church caught fire that evening. No bodies were found, but authorities reported finding a scorched motorcycle helmet and a Spanish license plate in the basement crypt. Whether Tonio died in the fire or used it to vanish remains one of Europe's lingering criminal mysteries. And Lucian? Some say he died in an Albanian port, strangled during a smuggling dispute. Others say he lived on under a new name in Bulgaria, operating a vineyard, and refusing to speak of the past. No one can say for certain, but what remained, long after the heist had faded from headlines, was the myth The Marseille job became whispered legend in criminal circles, a robbery not just of wealth, but of power. It proved that even those who lived above the law could be touched, that a plan, carefully woven with silence, shadows, and shared desperation, could crack the walls of fortified privilege. Years later, a new generation of hackers and thieves would quote lines from Owl's leak paper, see Clara's thermal charges and underground engineering manuals, and trace the outline of Lucian's vault blueprints and documentaries that never named him, because in the end, they hadn't just robbed a vault. They had robbed a myth and left behind one even larger. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In the heart of Krakow, Poland, during the winter of 1993, the city's ancient stone veins pulsed not only with history, but with secrets buried beneath decades of political upheaval and silent grudges. Snow fell in heavy sheets across the market square, muting the usual soundscape of shouting vendors and trolley bells. But inside an inconspicuous building nestled between a former printing press and an Orthodox tailor shop, a crime was unfolding that would eventually unravel into a national scandal. A web spun from the ruins of a country recently liberated from communist chains, but still shackled by its ghosts. The building was home to the Central Archive of National Transition, a state-run project established in 1991 to sort and classify the classified documents from the former Polish People's Republic. Tens of thousands of files filled the shelves, records of informants, intercepted communications, illicit transfers of assets, and secret political arrests. To the public, the archive represented transparency and healing, but to certain individuals, it was a ticking bomb. The lead archivist, Dr. Elżbieta Nowicka, was a stoic woman in her mid-50s, once a lecturer of Slavic linguistics at Jagiellonian University. She had been assigned the position for her neutrality, her reputation for loyalty to no party, and her exacting precision. Yet behind her cold professionalism lay a conflicted soul. Her brother, Janusz, had disappeared in 1982 under martial law, never seen again. And she had recently discovered, deep in a file mislabeled Miscellaneous, 1979, a surveillance transcript implicating a former high-ranking colonel in the security service as an orchestrator. That colonel was now known as Deputy Minister Tomasz Rablowski, respected untouchable, a reformist face on the national stage. Elżbieta knew what she held was radioactive. If released, the document could collapse the government. If buried, she would betray not only her brother's memory, but her country's march toward truth. 3 days later, the archive was robbed. There was no shattered glass, no alarms tripped. The thieves entered through the heating shaft system during a scheduled blackout for building maintenance. They moved with surgical precision. Surveillance records were wiped. Files from specific shelves were replaced with forgeries, so expertly replicated that only Elżbieta herself could spot the discrepancies. But she did. And when she did, she didn't call the police. She called an old friend. Inspector Marek Zielinski had once been a detective in the Krakow Militia Obladowska, the old communist police force. After 1989, he transitioned into the new civic guard under a cloud of suspicion, his loyalty questioned by both old comrades and new bureaucrats. He now worked cold cases in a half-lit office behind the new courthouse, forgotten by the powerful, but feared by the guilty. Marek believed in rot. He believed it started small, like mold behind wallpaper, and grew until the foundation of a home crumbled. So when Elżbieta brought in the forged documents, his first instinct wasn't confusion. It was confirmation. The two began a clandestine investigation. They worked after hours, using pre-digital methods to avoid surveillance. Handwritten notes, couriered messages, face-to-face interviews. Elżbieta fed him access credentials under false pretenses, and Marek began cross-referencing the remaining files for patterns of deletions. What he found was chilling. At least 35 files had been removed or forged, every one of them connected to individuals now in positions of influence. Judges, bankers, diplomats. The pattern was too tight, too coordinated, and each deletion coincided with a seemingly unrelated fire, car accident, or suicide that had occurred since January. Marek's theory was grim. Someone was not only scrubbing the historical record, they were eliminating the living witnesses. The trail led to a private security firm, Pol Secura, run by a former intelligence officer named Jerzy Janik. On paper, the company provided VIP protection and surveillance systems, but Merrick discovered that Pol Secura had access to government buildings far beyond the usual scope. Internal memos, quietly leaked to him through a contact at the Ministry of Interior, showed that Pol Secura was given a special contract to audit and digitize the Central Archive's contents, beginning 1 week before the break-in. Elżbieta's blood ran cold. They hadn't broken in to steal. They'd been let in under government sanction. The final clue came from an unexpected source. A janitor at the archive, a mute war veteran named Pavel, handed Elżbieta a stack of torn microfilm negatives. He had been collecting them from the trash every night, unsure of what they meant. Among them were incomplete records of telephone transcripts, one of which captured a conversation between Ravlusky and a mysterious caller. The subject? Eliminating leverage. Now Merrick and Elżbieta had more than suspicion. They had names. They had motive. But they also had a target painted on their backs. On March 19th, Elżbieta returned to the archive to find her office ransacked. Not by burglars, but by inspectors from the National Integrity Bureau. She was accused of theft, misuse of authority, and tampering with evidence. Her access was revoked. She was placed under house arrest. And 2 nights later, a brick was thrown through her apartment window with a note. Stop digging. Merrick, meanwhile, was reassigned to a rural district in Nowy Sachs with less than 24 hours' notice. He didn't go. Instead, he vanished. It was now a chess match played in shadows. Elżbieta, smuggling evidence piece by piece through trusted contacts. Merrick, operating from safe houses, using radio codes from his militia days, and always a looming hand of Pol Secura, tightening around them. The real twist came in early April, when a fire broke out in the Central Archive building. It started in the main records hall. The sprinkler system failed. By morning, 70% of the archive had turned to ash. The official report cited electrical failure, but Elżbieta had acted 2 days earlier. She had handed a single envelope to a Swiss journalist covering war crimes in the Balkans, and it was the original surveillance transcript linking Ravlusky to Janusz's disappearance, and more importantly, to the orchestration of internal disappearances under martial law. The journalist, David Meller, published a full expose in Zurich 3 weeks later. The Polish government tried to deny everything, but under international scrutiny, Jaruzelski resigned. A parliamentary inquiry was opened. Pol Secura disbanded quietly, and Elżbieta, once a faceless archivist, became a national symbol of integrity. Merrick was never seen again. Some say Merrick fled to Berlin, protected by old contacts within the now-fractured East German intelligence network. Others insist he made it as far as Oslo, where he lived under the name Henrik Sorensen, working as a clock repairman in a quiet fishing village. Elżbieta never confirmed nor denied these rumors. Her role was now part public, part legend. She gave no interviews after the inquiry, made no public statements, and denied any involvement beyond her duties as a state archivist. But hidden within the Polish National Library's new digital archive, a subfolder was discovered months later, encrypted, misfiled under 16th century religious documents. Inside were transcripts, images, and journal entries spanning decades. They told a different story, a larger one, about a plan codenamed Cherwony Red Whisper, a decades-long operation to embed informants within rising political classes after the fall of communism. Jaruzelski was not a rogue actor. He was merely the last active threat of a machine designed to rewrite history from within. The scandal rocked more than Poland. As journalists dug deeper, similar patterns were discovered in Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The Red Whisper scandal became a continental reckoning, forcing the European Union to commission a broad investigation into the shadowy legacy of Soviet-era intelligence networks. Institutions fell, trust collapsed, and the archivist who lit the match disappeared entirely. Elżbieta was last seen in 1994, walking into a train station in Bratislava. She wore a wool coat, carried a leather briefcase, and held no identification. Surveillance footage showed her boarding a train bound for Sarajevo, a city still in the midst of conflict. What she sought there, or whom, was never known. Some believe she sought revenge. Others believe she meant to vanish among chaos, to end where history screamed loudest. Yet her legacy remained. In 1995, a collection of anonymous letters arrived at the desks of human rights organizations across Europe. Each contained a scanned file, originals long since presumed destroyed. Some detailed executions by secret courts. Others payoff to journalists and foreign dignitaries. Each was signed only with the initials, Yan. A new archive was born in response. The Open Records Initiative, a decentralized, citizen-run system that began collecting, verifying, and preserving truth outside the reach of governments. It became a movement. The crimes committed in Krakow in 1993 were not merely acts of theft or corruption. They were acts of memory, of erasure and preservation. And those who waged a silent war did so not for gold or glory, but to wrest control of history from those who would bury it. Because some truths refuse to stay silent, and some crimes never stop echoing. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. The southern reaches of Africa, nestled between the Limpopo River and a crumbling colonial railway line. The town of Masvingo wore the heat of 1990 for like a burial shroud. Zimbabwe, once hailed as the breadbasket of the continent, was quietly unraveling in the years following independence. Political tensions simmer beneath the surface of every handshake and smile. Farmers complained of vanishing subsidies. Civil servants whispered of missing pensions. And somewhere beneath the dry ochre soil, a series of bones began to surface. The first skull was found by children playing hide and seek near a dried-up borehole on the outskirts of the Machik township. What they thought was a rock was soon revealed to be human, its forehead cracked, teeth half buried in the dirt. Authorities arrived with minimal fuss, treating the discovery as a relic of the Liberation War, a relic best left alone. But the second skull, found 2 weeks later, this time by a construction crew, was no relic. It bore a bullet hole, clean through the back. Detective Inspector Amos Manica of the Criminal Investigations Department in Harare was dispatched to Mesa Vingo under quiet orders. He was not told much, only that his discretion was paramount, and that he would be liaising directly with Central Intelligence, a former soldier turned policeman. Amos wore his experience like the creases in his jacket, visible, resilient, and sharp-edged. Upon arrival, he was handed photographs, 5 skulls, various femurs, scattered personal items, a rusted necklace, a faded identity card, a bullet casing. The local police had done what they were told. Nothing. No forensics, no statements taken, no public announcement. In truth, they were afraid. The land where the bones were found was once owned by the government, but had since been sold to a businessman named Nyan Niraj Chigumba, a name whispered in boardrooms, feared in bars. He was known not for his wealth, which was substantial, but for the trail of silence that followed his rise. Farms were seized, rivals disappeared, debts dissolved overnight, and now the land he owned was bleeding corpses. Amos began with the identity card. It belonged to a woman named Tariro Jeek, listed as a nurse who had gone missing in 1983 during the Gukurahundi massacres. Officially, she had been declared a casualty of war. Unofficially, she had vanished after filing complaint about abuses in a military camp. The implication was immediate and dangerous. These weren't just bones. They were ghosts of an atrocity the nation had never reckoned with. He met with elders in the township. Many refused to speak. Some stared blankly. One, an old grave digger named Sakuru Tavengwa, finally took him to a mango tree grove just beyond the farmlands. They came at night, the old man whispered. Military trucks, shovels, people screaming, then only silence, and sometimes laughter. Amos recorded every word. He sent a confidential memo to headquarters. Days passed, no reply. Then came a phone call, not from Harare, but from the Minister of Information himself. He was told, in no uncertain terms, to focus on present concerns. The past was unstable ground. It would bury even those who tried to dig it up. But Amos wasn't a man who let ghosts go quietly. He found a retired Army Sergeant, Jonas Mbaika, living on a disability pension outside Karedzi. Drunk and bitter, Jonas spoke freely after a few bottles of Zambezi beer. He described an operation, Clean Hand, ordered in early 1984 to eliminate dissenters within the ranks. Nurses, teachers, even some junior officers who questioned the conduct of senior commanders. They were called traitors, Jonas muttered. But they were just voices, good voices. The orders had come from a committee. Names weren't used, only ranks. But one stood out, Colonel D. Masingura, the same man now serving as the chief of national security under President Mugabe. Amos returned to Mesa Vingo in a haze of paranoia. His phone line crackled. Strangers loitered near his guest house. His driver refused to pick him up after dusk. He typed his reports on a manual typewriter and stashed copies beneath floorboards. He trusted no one. Then came the fire. A shack near the mango grove burned to the ground one night. Inside were two men, reportedly vagrants. But Amos recognized one of them, a cousin of Toriro Jeek. The man had spoken with him days earlier. His jaw had been wired shut from beatings he'd received during his arrest in 1985. Now he was ash. The next day, Amos's guest house room was searched. His notes were gone, but he had mailed copies to a colleague in Bulawayo, Detective Serenque, one of the few people he trusted. She arrived within 2 days, bringing with her a forensic pathologist and an independent journalist from South Africa. The journalist, Peter de Klerk, had been covering war crimes across Africa. He understood silence. He understood danger. And when he saw the skulls, he understood the power of memory. They began excavating discreetly, enlisting students from the university under the pretense of an anthropology project. In 3 weeks, they unearthed over 60 sets of remains. Each one told a story. Some had hands bound with wire. Others had broken ribs, signs of torture. One held a small Bible, burned at the edges. But truth has a price. One night, Peter was attacked. His notes and camera were taken. He survived with a fractured arm. Sarah received anonymous threats. Amos was summoned to Harare, but he never arrived. His car was found abandoned near a riverbed. Doors open, papers scattered, blood on the steering wheel. But Sarah didn't stop. She contacted Peter's agency, which published a piece in Johannesburg, The Forgotten Graves of Masvingo. Photos, testimonies, satellite images. It spread quickly, igniting outrage and fear. The Zimbabwean government denounced the story as foreign propaganda. Yet the people began to speak. Funeral ceremonies were held. Names were whispered again. A memorial was built, unofficial but respected. And Amos? Some say he crossed into Mozambique. Others say he was buried beneath the same mango trees. He once walked in silence. The graves of Mesa Vingo were no longer forgotten. But justice, as always, remained elusive. Sarah and Kayob left Mesa Vingo 2 weeks after the article went viral, disappearing across the border into Botswana with Peter de Klerk and the surviving records hidden inside hollowed-out volumes of a discarded government library set. In Gaborone, they met with Amnesty International representatives who, stunned by the scope of evidence, launched a formal petition for a multinational inquiry into wartime atrocities committed by the Zimbabwean government. But the United Nations, paralyzed by regional alliances and backdoor diplomacy, refused to act. Peters Exposed was nominated for multiple journalism awards, but he turned them down. What we uncovered isn't for trophies, he told one radio host. It's for tombstones. Meanwhile, the grave site in Mesa Vingo was fenced off by government contractors. Signs reading protected historical site. No trespassing went up overnight. Trucks removed the remaining bones. Locals reported hearing jackhammers echoing through night, and by morning, what a mango grove once stood was nothing but leveled red dust and a shallow trench lined with cinder blocks. A shopping complex would be built there, officials claimed, to improve economic development. Sarah continued her work in exile. She coordinated with dissidents in Zambia and underground journalists across the continent. Whistleblowers came forward, former soldiers, archivists, and even priests who had witnessed the executions. Their testimonies described torture chambers beneath military hospitals, secret trials held in abandoned railway stations, and unmarked graves that stretched across 4 provinces. In 1995, a leaked document reached Sarah from within the Zimbabwean parliament. It detailed a black budget initiative called Operations Vekapra, translated loosely as it is done. The operation's mission was to eliminate all remaining witnesses of pre-1987 purges. It listed names, dates, and funding sources. On the final page was a list marked in process. Amos Manika's name was there. So was hers. Sarah moved again, this time to Nairobi under a different name. Peter returned to Johannesburg and never published another political piece. Some say the guilt consumed him. Others believe he was warned. Back in Zimbabwe, the silence held for a time, but every few years, another skull would surface, uncovered by flooding or construction, or the stubborn roots of baobab trees. And each time, someone would remember, someone would whisper, someone would dig. In 1997, a group of university students began archiving the stories into an anonymous digital repository they called the Mukambura Files, named after a mass grave site in Mashonaland. It became a hidden Wikipedia of grief, where users submitted testimonies, maps, and evidence. It grew slowly, then rapidly, reaching exile communities across London, Toronto, and Cape Town. Then came a breakthrough. A former minister's son leaked a videotape showing a 1984 field execution by mass soldiers. It aired briefly on South African television before being pulled under legal threat. But the spark had caught. Protests erupted in Harare, then in Bulawayo, and then among Zimbabwean students in Europe. Old men in rural villages began to speak again. They named the dead. They drew maps in sand. They led young activists to forgotten forests where old boots and bones still rose from the earth like memories refusing burial. The government issued more denials, but the narrative was no longer theirs to command. By 1999, the Red Archive Project had published a comprehensive record of more than 2,100 individuals believed to have been executed and buried in unmarked graves during 1983 to 1987. They named names, victims, soldiers, commanders, and financiers. And though no court would take the case and no tribunal would hear it, the world began to shift its gaze. Foreign aid was restructured. Officials were sanctioned. Arms deals were canceled. The pressure mounted. In the end, no one knows if Amos lived long enough to see it. But in Masvingo, every August, near the trench where the shopping mall was never built, families gather. Quietly, they bring candles, photographs, names on slips of paper. They plant mango trees. And they remember, by the time the new millennium approached, the names of the dead in Mesa Vingo had begun to circulate in history departments across the world. Universities in Oxford, Nairobi, and Cape Town offered courses on post-conflict memory, often citing the Mukambura Files and the Red Archive Project. Yet inside Zimbabwe, the names remained dangerous. Possessing the files was enough to get someone detained. Speaking them aloud in public could lead to disappearances. Still, a generation raised in whispers had learned how to speak with code, with poetry, and with silence louder than sirens. In 2001, a play titled The Trees that saw premiered in a repurposed church in Bulawayo. Written anonymously, it told the story of a nurse who vanished after witnessing a secret massacre. The performance never mentioned the government or the war, but everyone understood. The play ran for 3 weeks before being shut down by police. Its actors fled. The building was later found burned, but bootleg scripts traveled through high schools. Its lines were quoted at vigils. It had left a mark. Sarah and Jub, living in Nairobi under the alias Ruth Mlenga, watched from a distance. She taught sociology at a private college, never revealing her past. But she mentored young journalists, steered them toward hard truths, and reminded them, carefully, how stories survive even when evidence burns. Peter had long gone silent. His last email to her simply read, "Human rights organizations and student activists." His final dossier, titled Witnesses of Sand, was leaked in 2003. It contained coordinates to 47 suspected burial sites. In response, the Zimbabwean government launched a counter-narrative campaign. State media aired documentaries framing the mass graves as victims of colonial-era tribal wars and accused foreign governments of psychological warfare. Billboards across Harare read, "Let's not be deceived." But it was too late. The deception was no longer sustainable. That same year, a tribunal convened in The Hague, not to prosecute, but to hear public testimony from survivors and exiles. Sarah testified under her alias, breaking down when shown a photograph of the Bible found in the Mesa Vingo grave. It had belonged to her cousin. She left the chamber unable to finish. Later, one of the tribunal panelists, a Ghanaian judge named Kojo Mensah, summed it up simply: sometimes, justice is not conviction, it is confirmation. In Mas Vingo, the grove of mango trees planted in memory of the victims had grown taller. Locals called it Nguviatica Tora, the time we spoke. Each August, the families returned. They brought new names. They left old letters. A wooden plaque stood in the middle of the grove with no names, just a phrase. For those who vanished, and those who remembered. The shopping mall was never completed. Investors pulled out amid protests and bad press. The concrete trench became overgrown, taken back by weeds and vines. Children played there again. Some of them knew the stories. Others only heard fragments of a man who once asked too many questions and the ghosts he unearthed. A new government came to power in the early 2010s, promising reforms. They reopened some cases, exhumed one mass grave under international pressure, and declared a National Day of Remembrance. But the committee findings were buried in bureaucracy, and key officials from the 1980s had either died or fled. Accountability remained elusive, and yet the memory held. Young filmmakers in Harare began telling fictionalized versions of the events, funded independently, and shown in underground cinemas. Musicians composed albums inspired by the shadow years. Even government officials speaking off the record admitted that the old silence had cracked. In 2020, a museum in Johannesburg opened an exhibit titled Bones and Names, The Mas Vingo Truth. It featured artifacts recovered by Sarah and Peter, including the rusted necklace, the Bible, and a replica of Amos's handwritten notes. A wall in the exhibit displayed a quote in Shona and English: "When they bury the truth, we grow it back in trees." At the end of the exhibit, visitors could write a message on a red slip of paper and pin it to a wall called the Living Testimony. Thousands did. Some wrote names, others drew maps. A few left simple messages. I remember Sarah, now frail, visited the exhibit in secret one evening. A curator recognized her. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. She walked slowly past the cases, stopped at the Bible, and placed her hand on the glass. Then she left, disappearing once more into the long dust of African memory, where justice comes not in courts or headlines, but in names spoken aloud, trees planted, and stories that refuse to die. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In the dense industrial sprawl of Shenzhen in 1994, a city swollen with a fever of sudden capital and silent desperation, a murder took place that would fracture the illusion of progress in the newly reformed economic zones. Lin Wei, a mid-tier logistics manager in one of the hundreds of foreign-backed electronics factories, was found dead in his compact apartment near the Bantian district. His face submerged in a ceramic basin of red-stained water, wrists bound with factory-grade plastic tie straps, and his fingernails blackened as though dipped in soot. The room was untouched otherwise. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, only the slow, rhythmic drip of a broken faucet echoing through. The silence. Detective Inspector Gao Shuling of the Shenzhen Municipal Public Security Bureau was assigned to the case, a man known less for his rank than for his reputation. Gao had worked narcotics in Guangzhou before being demoted for exposing a smuggling ring linked to a provincial party secretary. They had transferred him to Shenzhen as a form of exile, but Gao didn't mind. Shenzhen, to him, was a city in flux, where corruption wore a tailored suit and the truth had a habit of leaking through unfinished foundations. His first visit to the crime scene made it immediately clear. This was no ordinary murder. The basin was not standard bathroom fare. It was ceremonial porcelain, lined with golden koi designs used in ancestral rituals. On the sink's chipped edge lay a handwritten receipt for a customs clearance signed by Lin Wei just 3 days prior. Gao pocketed it. He knew the port well. Nothing passed through without a price, and the price was often paid in silence or blood. Gao's inquiries led him to the logistics hub where Lin had worked, a sprawling multi-warehouse complex managed by a company named Hanyu Global Freight. It had grown rapidly since 1991, aided by questionable loans and guarded by private security men who looked like ex-military. The factory manager, a smooth-talking Cantonese named Mr., greeted Gao with bureaucratic indifference. Lin was quiet, dependable, he said, eyes flicking to the hidden cameras behind Gao. But he was not special, certainly not important enough to be killed. But Gao had learned to read the margins of a man's statement, the breath taken between words, the stiffness in shoulders, the glance toward exits. Lin had been important to someone, that much was clear. And it wasn't about who he was, but what he'd seen. Digging into Lin Wei's assignments revealed a pattern. For the past 6 months, he had been rerouted from internal transfers to special clearance shipments, freight that skipped regular customs and was marked for direct delivery to warehouse number 7B, a section of the hub cordoned off from regular staff. Gao tried to visit it and was turned away with veiled threats. "You are wasting your time, Inspector," a man in an unmarked uniform said. "There's nothing here but deadlines and dust." That night, Gao returned alone, dressed in civilian clothes. He scaled the outer fence under cover of the midnight drizzle and crept towards 7B. Inside, he found not electronics, but crates marked in Cyrillic, heavy wooden boxes, each stamped with the name of a city in Siberia. One had cracked open. Inside, he saw military-grade signal jammers, satellite interceptors, and Russian field radios. He snapped 2 photographs with his pocket camera before he heard the dog. He ran. 2 nights later, his apartment was ransacked. The negatives from his camera were gone. A note was left behind, typed and signed. Some things rot in silence. Don't dig. But Gao was already past fear. He met with Lin Wei's sister, a quiet schoolteacher named Lin Yu. She had been the last person to speak with her brother. He had called her 2 days before his death, saying only, "If something happens to me, look behind the koi." Behind the koi, the bowl. Gao obtained the basin from evidence storage, with careful gloves and a flashlight. He examined the painted koi on the ceramic. One of them, near the rim, had a line of glaze slightly raised. He chipped at it. Underneath, embedded in the porcelain, was a microfilm strip. He had to borrow a projector from a university contact to view it. What he saw changed everything. It was a list of serial numbers, shipment records, foreign accounts, names written in Cyrillic and Chinese. Beside each name, a transfer amount, a destination, and a date. Smuggling routes connecting Russian arms dealers to Hong Kong fronts, laundering money through mainland factories. And Lin Wei had somehow found himself in the middle of it. The case was no longer about murder. It was about a pipeline of corruption so vast it eclipsed the reach of provincial authorities. Gao now understood the ceremonial nature of Lin's death, a warning and a message. He had washed his hands in something unclean, and now his blood paid the price. Gao tried to file an internal report. His supervisor, Deputy Chief Han, read it in silence, then shredded the first 3 pages. "I advise you," he said, not looking up, "to consider this case closed." Gao walked out of the station that day knowing he was alone. The next step was riskier. He contacted a Hong Kong-based journalist named Evelyn Tam, a reporter with a history of uncovering industrial scandals. They met in the back of a noodle shop near Lo Wu Station. He passed her a copy of the microfilm. "Don't print it yet," he warned. "They'll kill you faster than they killed him. But back it up twice." Evelyn agreed. That night, someone tried to run Gao off the road. By the second week of his rogue investigation, Gao Shuling knew he had burned every bridge behind him. His calls to old friends in the bureau went unanswered. His apartment was now under casual surveillance by men who wore watches too tight and shoes too polished. He had been locked out of the official case files. But Gao was no stranger to isolation. It had been his companion since his demotion from Guangzhou. He knew how to vanish in a crowd, how to communicate in code, and more importantly, how to wait. Evelyn Tam had vanished for 3 days after their meeting. Gao feared the worst. But on the 4th day, she reappeared, exhausted, drenched from the storm and holding a waterproof pouch. Inside were 3 microfilm backups and a printed translation of the Russian documents. Her source, a Ukrainian former intelligence officer turned arms broker, had confirmed the authenticity. The shipments were real, the accounts traceable, and more damning. The names included mid-ranking PLA officers and party-connected businessmen. They met in a safe house Gao had once used to shelter a witness during a narcotics trial. The walls were thin, but the locks were strong. Evelyn read aloud from the translation. Each shipment originated from Novosibirsk, rerouted through Kazan, flown by a false manifest to a civilian hub in Urumqi, and from their truck, by Hanyu Global Freight, into Shenzhen's warehouses, bypassing all customs checks. Inside the crates, military electronics, encryption modules, radio warfare tools. Each item worth thousands on the black market. Lin Wei, it turned out, had discovered a deviation. One shipment logged in the official manifest never arrived at Warehouse 7B. Instead, it had been redirected to a small coastal village east of Shantau, to a decommissioned naval depot. Recognized the location. Years earlier, the depot had been used in a heroin bust linked to Vietnamese syndicates. It was remote, forgotten, the perfect dead drop. Together, Gao and Evelyn traveled to the village in an unmarked sedan borrowed from Evelyn's cousin. The road was narrow, cracked from years of typhoon damage, and overgrown. Along the coast, broken docks jetted into gray water like crooked teeth. The depot stood silent, its rusted gates chained but not locked. Inside, they found rows of empty crates. Rats had made homes of the splinters. But in one sealed office, hidden beneath a collapsed ceiling tile, Gao found a folder marked with a seal. Fair base. The documents inside confirmed that the depot had served as a secondary storage hub, a place to siphon off weapons for private resale. One receipt showed a transfer of equipment to a private security firm based in Singapore. Recognized the name. The same company had handled security at Hanyu's main warehouse. This is no longer about arms, Evelyn said quietly. This is about a shadow economy. She was right. What began as a single murder had unraveled into an international ring of covert trade, state complicity, and ruthless silencing. And Lin Wei, the quiet logistics man, had stumbled into it by accident. The question now was, who else knew? On the drive back, Gao's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered. A voice said, "Inspector Gao, this is your only warning. Go to Kowloon, booth 17 at the old ferry terminal. Noon tomorrow. Come alone." The line went dead. Evelyn advised against it. "It's a trap," she said. "They know you're close." "I know," Gao replied. "That's why I'll go." The next day, Gao arrived early. The ferry terminal was half abandoned, littered with old ticket stubs and the scent of diesel. Booth 17 sat in shadow. He approached it, hand near the concealed revolver he had tucked into his waistband. Inside, a man waited, late 50s, salt and pepper hair, suit tailored but worn. He did not offer a name. "You've made powerful enemies," he said. "So I've been told. This goes higher than you think." Lin Wei was just one thread. Pulling on him pulls the whole fabric. What you found, it's not a story. It's a declaration of war. Gao remained still. "Then why are you talking to me?" "Because I want out," the man said, "and because I knew your father." The man passed him a slim envelope. Inside were photos, grainy shots of two men shaking hands on a tarmac. One of them was Mr. Yao, the logistics hub manager. The other was a known arms dealer on Interpol's red list. "This is the last time we speak," the man said. "Destroy everything or you'll join Lin Wei." Back in the safe house, Evelyn examined the photos. Her hands trembled. "I can't sit on this anymore. We have enough to go public. We have names, locations, documents. We have a pattern. We also have targets on our backs. So what do we do?" Gao looked at the envelope, then at the red-lit window beyond. "We make it impossible for them to kill the truth." They spent the next week assembling packets of evidence. Each contained copies of the microfilm, the depot records, the photographs, and Evelyn's translations. One went to a dissident radio station in Taipei, another to a reformist newspaper in Seoul. A third was mailed anonymously to a member of the U.S. Senate Subcommittee on Arms Control. A fourth, Gao Han delivered to a British consulate in Hong Kong. Within 2 weeks, The leak reached international headlines. Shadow trade routes linked Chinese logistics firm to Russian arms dealers. Chinese state media dismissed it as fabrication. Investigations were announced and quietly shelved. But the names were out. The evidence was public. Whispers had become accusations. 2 days after the story broke, Hanyu Global Freight was shuttered. Mr. Yao disappeared. Evelyn's name surfaced in a government notice. Trattor's collusion with hostile foreign media. She fled to Thailand. Gao vanished from Shenzhen. But the story did not end. 6 months later, the world had already moved on. The headlines that once blazed across front pages now lay buried beneath stories of trade talks and diplomatic summits. But the consequences of Gao and Evelyn's actions rippled through quiet corridors and anonymous decisions, like poison diluted in the bloodstream of politics. Gao Shueilin lived under a false name in Chiang Mai, Thailand, in a modest guest house tucked between a shuttered tea house and a travel agency that rarely had clients. His once sharp suit had been traded for faded shirts and fisherman's pants. But his mind remained sharp, haunted. He spent his days scribbling notes in a coded journal and watching the river flow as he tried to convince himself that what he had done mattered. Occasionally, he would receive coded letters from Evelyn, now living in exile in Paris, working under a pseudonym for an investigative agency. Her life, like his, was reduced to shadows and aliases. One of her letters brought news. 2 of the Russian arms brokers named in the microfilm had been arrested in Bucharest. A third was found dead under suspicious circumstances near St. Petersburg. The syndicate was unraveling, slowly, chaotically, but unraveling all the same. But justice was a ghost in Gao's world, something whispered about, but never touched. One humid evening in July, Gao received a visitor. He had just returned from the market with lychees and black tea, when a man stepped into his path outside the guest house. Mid-30s, Singaporean accent, clean-shaven and confident. The man extended a hand, smiling. "Inspector Gao," he said, "or do you prefer Mr. Lee these days?" Gao did not answer. "My employer would like to speak with you." "It's not a threat," the man added, anticipating the recoil in Gao's eyes. "It's a proposition." In the back of a black SUV parked along a quiet lane, Gao met the employer. She was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired, wearing linen slacks and sunglasses despite the dusk. She introduced herself simply as Madame Zhang. "I used to work for the Ministry of State Security," she said, "before retirement." "What do you want from me?" Gao asked. "Not much, just to know where your archive is." Gao remained silent. "You made copies. You distributed them. But you kept the originals." "I want them." "Why?" "Because while the world was watching the story you helped leak, some very real enemies were watching our silence. And now certain balances are shifting. I don't play politics. Everyone plays politics. Inspector, even in hiding." When Gao refused, the car door opened. He stepped out. The SUV disappeared without sound, like a ghost. That night, he dug up a tin box buried beneath the floorboards of his room. Inside were the original microfilm, his coded journals, a blackened USB drive, and the last photo of Lin Wei smiling in front of the warehouse gates. He stared at it for a long time. The next day, he mailed the tin box anonymously. A post office in Manila, one he knew Evelyn could access. Then he burned the remaining copies. 2 weeks later, Evelyn's article appeared under pseudonym in Le Monde Diplomatique. The Khoi Bowl Conspiracy. How one murder unraveled a military black market. It detailed everything. The smuggling routes, the depot, the customs bypasses, the links to both Chinese and Russian officials. It included scans from a microfilm, transcripts of Gao's notes, and a map of the dead drop location. It ended with a simple line. The whistle was blown. Whether anyone listened is another story. Back in Shenzhen, the fallout continued in whispers. A new internal party audit was launched. Several low-ranking customs officers disappeared or were reassigned to rural provinces. Hanyu's financial records were wiped from the state database. The factory that once processed the shipments was bulldozed and renamed. But the rot was not removed, only reburied deeper. One cold morning in November, Gao stood on a bridge in Chiang Mai, watching monks cross beneath in saffron robes. He felt tired, older than he was. A man walked up beside him and lit a cigarette. "You did good work," the man said, not looking at him. But good work doesn't always mean clean endings. Gao turned. The man was already gone. In the years that followed, Evelyn would publish 2 more reports, each drawing faint lines back to the original story. Both were met with denials, but each time, more of the infrastructure around the shadow network cracked. International banks froze accounts. A diplomatic scandal in Singapore exposed a contract signed with a shell company from a microfilm. The syndicate was never fully named, but its reach weakened. Lin Wei's name never made it into the reports. Gao had asked Evelyn to keep it that way. He didn't die for fame, he had said. He died trying to do his job. And so the basin with the koi fish, the first clue in a story that bled across borders and bodies, remained in a locked case in a consulate archive unmarked, its true value known only to a handful of people who once dared to listen when silence had seemed safer. In the end, Gao never returned to China. He remained a ghost, drifting between islands, changing names, always watching, always waiting. But he carried one truth with him. Sometimes justice doesn't come in courtrooms or tribunals. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a whisper through barbed wire, or a name finally spoken in the halls of forgotten. And sometimes justice is just survival and the courage not to forget. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. In the sweltering heat of a New Orleans summer in 1994, where jazz echoed down the alleyways of the French Quarter and the Mississippi's muddy waters shimmered under a heavy sky, a crime unfurled that would send shockwaves to the fractured corridors of law enforcement and organized crime alike. It began not with a body, but with a box. A simple, unmarked wooden crate delivered to the doorstep of the 3rd Precinct of the New Orleans Police Department. Inside, $25,000 in neatly stacked bills, a severed hand wrapped in butcher's paper, and a note scrawled in looping cursive. He spoke too loudly. Listen better. Detective Alphonse Rivas was called in before dawn, summoned from a restless sleep by the shrill ring of a rotary phone and the panicked tone of Captain Hensley's voice. Rivas, a second-generation Cuban-American with a reputation for solving what others wouldn't touch, had seen his share of cruelty in a city that swallowed the innocent with the same appetite as it fed its nightly tourists. But this case smelled different, not of blood, but of calculation. Whoever left that box knew it would spark a storm, and they were counting on it. The hand, according to the coroner, belonged to a man in his late 40s. No prints, no tattoos, clean cut, sawed, not hacked, as if done by someone with medical training. The money had no serial links to any known robbery, but each stack was bundled with a small red paper clip, an unusual detail that tickled Rivas's instincts. He had seen red paper clips once before, in a report from a 1987 smuggling case that involved a now-defunct shipping company called Delta Trident Maritime. Shut down after a raid on their warehouse, uncovered a half-ton of unregistered firearms and Colombian cocaine. Rivas's first move was to visit the archives. Beneath dust-laden file drawers and forgotten microfilm, he dug up the Delta Trident files. Sure enough, the same red paper clips had been used to tag bundles of cash seized in the raid. But what caught his eye was the name of the shipping agent listed on the original customs paperwork, Victor St. James, a known associate of the Marigny Syndicate, a loosely connected web of import-export fronts suspected of trafficking everything from endangered species to stolen art. St. James had disappeared in 1989 after testifying against one of his own, but no body was ever found. Some believed he had been shipped to Honduras under witness protection. Others whispered he was buried beneath one of the newly renovated hotels on Bourbon Street. Rivas didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in trails, and the trail led him to the docks. Pier 42 was where the old port rats said the real business went down behind padlocked containers, under the watch of longshoremen who spoke in shrugs and silence. Rivas spent 3 days just watching. On the 4th day at dusk, he saw it. A crate unloaded without documentation, moved with unusual haste into a black van with no plates. He followed it across the city to a warehouse in the Bywater district, an area supposedly reclaimed for artists and galleries, but where back doors still led to darker trades. Rivas called for backup, but no one came. He entered alone. Inside the warehouse, he found more crates, all unmarked. One was open inside medical supplies. Another, crates of vintage wine. But a third, which was sealed until he pried it open, held bricks of cash, banded just like the ones in the precinct box. Red paper clips and all. He photographed everything. As he turned to leave, he heard a sound. A single cough behind him. He spun, gun drawn. A man stood in the shadows. Thin, older, sharply dressed in a cream-colored suit stained with what looked like wine. His hands were up, but there was something smug in his posture. "You must be Detective Rivas," the man said, accent faintly Cajun. "You're early." Step into the light. He did. Rivas recognized him instantly. Victor St. James. "You're dead." St. James smiled. "You're not the first to say that." Before Rivas could respond, the door behind him slammed shut. The lights cut out. A struggle ensued, brief violence. Rivas shot blindly, hitting someone by the sound of scream, but he was outnumbered. Something hit him hard behind the ear. He woke up on a levee, blood in his mouth and his badge gone. When he returned to the warehouse, it had been cleaned out. No crates, no bodies, no signs of a break-in. His camera was gone too. Captain Hensley didn't believe a word. Worse, Internal Affairs showed up the next morning. The cash in the precinct box had vanished from evidence lockup. The official record now said it had never existed. Rivas was suspended pending a psychological evaluation. They called him unstable, obsessive, even suggested he planted the box himself. But someone believed him. 2 days into his suspension, he received a call from a payphone near Lafayette Square. The voice on the other end was female, clipped, urgent. "I saw what you saw, and I can prove it. Meet me under the Claiborne overpass." Tonight, he went. What he found was not what he expected. A woman in her late 30s, sharp-eyed, with an FBI badge tucked in her jacket. Special Agent Marla Duval. She'd been working a parallel case, tracking a money laundering ring out of Baton Rouge that linked back to the Marigny Syndicate and, by extension, to Victor St. James. She'd lost 2 informants in the past month. One was found floating in the Gulf. The other, well, she said, he might have been the one who lost a hand. "They're cleaning house," she said. "Something big is coming. They don't want loose ends." Rivas showed her the only piece of evidence he had left, a red paper clip. She laughed. He kept a souvenir. "No," he said. "I kept a reminder." Together, they began to connect dots. St. James had faked his death, likely with the help of corrupt marshals, and was now operating under a shell identity, using medical shipments to launder cartel money. The severed hand, they deduced, was a message to someone inside the force, perhaps even Hensley. That's why no one came when Rivas called. That's why the warehouse was scrubbed. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. Rivas entered the warehouse alone, pistol raised, nerves tense like piano wire. He'd learned long ago that fear wasn't the enemy, it was hesitation. The crates were exactly as he remembered, marked innocuously, the kind you could hide anything in as long as the paperwork looked dull enough. But it was a silence that struck him now. Silence, in a city like New Orleans, was a warning. Victor St. James stood before him, pale under the dim emergency light. His smirk hadn't faded. "You're lucky I'm fond of theatrics," he said, gesturing to the crates. "Most men don't get warnings." Rivas kept his aim steady. "You're under arrest, St. James, or whoever you are now." "I've been many men," the smuggler replied. "But you should be more concerned with who you're working for." Before Rivas could press him, the lights cut out again. Shadows moved. A struggle erupted. 2 men rushing him from the side. He dropped one with shot to the thigh, but the second clipped his jaw, sending him sprawling. By the time he recovered, they were gone, and so was St. James. It took hours to crawl back to the precinct. His calls went unanswered, his injuries dismissed. But Agent Duval had left a message. They made a move. "Meet me now." She picked him up in an unmarked sedan, her face pale with tension. She drove them out of town, into the humid dark of the bayou, a safe house owned by an XDA contact. There, she showed Rivas her trump card, a USB drive with financial data from offshore accounts linked to the Marigny syndicate. Transactions detailing money funneled through fake humanitarian orgs, then routed into real estate projects up and down the Gulf Coast. This isn't just drugs anymore, she said. It's influence, politics, a new order. One entry stood out: a wire transfer from a Panamanian shell corporation to a campaign account for Judge Terrence Boone, a federal judge in Baton Rouge, known for throwing out key smuggling indictments. Boone had once served with Hensley in the National Guard. It clicked. The whole system was contaminated. Rivas's own precinct wasn't just compromised. It was a node in a network of silence. They needed leverage. Rivas knew of one man who might provide it, a retired customs officer named Saul Ledham, who disappeared into the bayous after a scandal in '88. He was rumored to have kept evidence on smuggling operations that involved Delta Trident and others, proof that St. James's death had been staged. They found him in a fishing cabin off of Chafalea Swamp, gray-haired and half-drunk, but lucid. He recognized St. James immediately. The bastard paid off half the dockmasters from here to Corpus. When the heat got close, he burned the records. But I kept a few things. Let him hand it over a weathered leather binder filled with manifests, doctor ledgers, and photos. One showed St. James at a gala with none other than Captain Hensley. The date was April 1993, back in New Orleans. The news broke of an explosion near the Claiborne overpass. An anonymous tip led police to a scorched warehouse, one that once belonged to Delta Trident. Inside they found ashes, twisted metal, and something else, a charred hand with a red paper clip melted into the flesh. The message was clear. They know we're watching, Duval whispered. 2 days later, Ledham was found dead, apparent suicide by shotgun. But Rivas knew better. He and Duval went underground. They copied the files, mailed them anonymously to 3 national newspapers, and sent encrypted copies to a federal grand jury, being quietly assembled in Chicago. Then they waited. The backlash was swift. An investigative series ran in the New York Times, exposing layers of corruption in Southern customs agencies, linked donations to shady developers and political campaigns, and hinted at broader federal negligence. Rivas's name never appeared, nor Duval's. But behind closed doors, indictments were prepared. By Christmas 1994, Judge Boone resigned. Captain Hensley went on extended medical leave. Victor St. James vanished again. But the money trail lived on.